Gente, bom
Good
dia.
morning.
Vamos
Let us
recomeçar tudo
restart
de novo.
all over again.
Bem-vindos,
Welcome,
bem-vindas,
welcome to
bem-vindes
everyone to
a
this
esse
seminar,
seminário,
to
a
this
esse
meeting,
encontro
this final meeting
final da pesquisa
about the
Respostas
research
Indígenas à
Indigenous
COVID-19 no
response to
Brasil,
COVID-19
arranjos
in
sociais de
Brazil,
saúde
social
global.
arrangements in
Eu sou
global
o José
health. I'm José
Miguel, eu
Miguel.
sou
I'm a
professor na
professor at
Faculdade de Saúde
Public
Pública
Health
da
School
USP,
of USP,
junto com a Maria
and
Paula
with Maria Paula
Prates, com a
Prates,
professora Cristina
Christine
McCord,
McCord,
com Amanda
Amanda
Horta, com
Horta,
Spence Pimentel e com Bruno
Spency,
Marques. A
Bruno.
gente
We
co-coordenou, a
co-coordinated,
gente
we
tocou durante os
over
últimos
the
quase
past
2
almost 2 years, we
anos
co-coordinated this
esse
project
projeto
that is
super
very
bonito,
beautiful,
grande,
large, and
importante
important
para entender as respostas
to better
indígenas
understand the
à
indigenous
COVID-19 no
response to
Brasil.
COVID-19 in Brazil.
Estamos hoje nesse
We
evento de
are
encerramento,
now in
estamos
this
super
closing
atrasados por uma
event. We're
série
super late
grande de
because of a
problemas
series of
técnicos
technical
que
problems
saíram completamente das nossas
that
mãos,
were
mas
totally
estamos
out of
aqui,
hand.
pedimos
But we
desculpas
do
pelo atraso
apologize
e
for the
agradecemos a
delay and
paciência.
thank you so much for your
Para
patience.
começar, eu vou
To
passar a
begin,
palavra para a
I'm going to
professora
pass the floor
Cristina
to
McCord,
Professor
da
Christine
Universidade
McCord
de
from the
Londres,
University of London, who was
foi
the
a
head
pesquisadora
researcher
principal
for this
desse
project.
projeto.
So,
Então,
Christine, thank you
Christine,
so
muito
much
obrigado
for
por
everything
tudo, mas também pela tua
and
companhia e tua
also for your
presença
company
aqui,
and presence here.
e te
We hear you.
escutamos.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to try to be really brief. And I want to start by just saying thank you to various people. So first of all, to the Medical Research Council who funded this research and their confidence in the project and their support for us. It's been fantastic. I want to thank Maria Paula especially for all her hard work coordinating this very complex, very intense project that took place on a large scale and over a short period of time during a pandemic, and also all the co-investigators and all the Indigenous co-researchers who've contributed so much to the work. Finally, thank you, of course, to all the participants in the communities who spoke, who contributed in various ways. So I'm just going to give a few thoughts before we hear the different speakers about my own reflections and impressions from the project overall. So first of all, I think the methodology of the project is important, and we can share this, I hope, and we can learn something from it. So I think in some ways we have taken very useful lessons from Indigenous cosmologies to understand better how everything is connected, how all things are connected, and to try to echo that in the approach of the research. So we're trying to connect different disciplines. We're linking ethnographic text with different forms, film, photography, sound, and so on, which gives it much greater richness. I think we have used a more genuinely participatory approach to the research than is very common. We have a lot of rhetoric about this and not so much in practice. And also, it's an example of a larger scale and quite complicated collaboration in anthropology, and it's a model for doing that, I think. So my reflections about the project and what we can learn from this more generally, of course, there are many lessons, and you're going to hear a lot about those today and read more on the website about these. But just a few reflections from myself, I suppose. I make a lot of connections between my own experience and my feelings about what's happened in Britain over the last couple of years, and learning about Brazil and understanding the differences and the similarities. So in Britain, we had a government that took a very reactive but very centralized and top-down approach to the pandemic. It took a very capitalist approach, if you like, to solving these very complex public health problems. It failed to connect with communities. It failed to listen to those communities and learn from people and hear from people. And many of the unnecessary illness and death and the financial costs that we have experienced have resulted from these gaps, this failure to listen and connect with people, I think. I think also for us and for Brazil, the pandemic really shone a very harsh light on the inequities that we already experience and were magnified by the situation of the pandemic. So there's a lot of things that we have in common as well as differences there. And we also saw how community networks played a valuable role, many of which was very informal, disconnected from the formal networks, but doing important work in terms of resilience and drawing back on social connections in order to cope in this very challenging situation. And we also saw how having a national health service and good community networks helped the vaccine program to be very successful in Britain. So what about lessons from Brazil? I suppose for me, I could see that the overall lack of government response, there was in a way a need for more centralized response, but it did create the space for local communities to take action and to use their creativity and to really draw back on their traditional knowledge and resilience. And I think we hear a lot about this in the project. Just thinking on to challenges for the future as well. I hope that we can draw lessons for Brazil and for other countries from the learning in this project. I hope that we can learn something for future pandemics. I have some doubts about this, that perhaps many governments don't want to learn the deeper lessons, but I remain hopeful that we can learn something. And I hope that the state agencies and public health can learn from the responses of the indigenous communities in Brazil, for Brazil and for other countries, how we can be more resilient and creative in the face of crises in the future. So that's me for now.
Ok, Christine, thank you very much. Muito obrigado, Christine. Eu vou passar a palavra agora para a professora Maria Paula Prates,
the General Coordinator,
que foi a coordenadora geral da operação,
operation, and she made things happen, like Christine said. And,
então,
well,
Maria Paula,
we can see
obrigado,
you and hear you.
E bom, te ouvimos e vemos.
Good morning, everyone in Brazil, and good afternoon if you're not in Brazil. I'd also like to thank you for the several different layers of cooperation. Chris is the principal investigator and for giving us daily support in all our questions, dilemmas, and problems with her experience in project coordination, to my peers as investigators with whom we shared weekly hours of conversation and parallel studies. And above all, I'd like to say that we've come to a point of conclusion of our research project, and one of its main characteristics, which are not that common to anthropology studies, the duration. It was a full 12 months, but we set out to carry out several case studies in the middle of a pandemic or hurricane, as it were, and that was just an additional challenge. And, well, I think this is a first project, and PARI-c is this project that ends with the publication of the case studies and the other materials, but it can also serve as a testimonial to what happened and can open up the doors to other studies, not only by us directly involved with PARI-c, but also by other researchers and colleagues, and also in terms of the way to do research, where we created this symmetrical collaboration between indigenous and non-indigenous researchers. We've all been researchers, and if you take into account the indigenous researchers, we wanted to give them greater visibility, but the work was actually carried out by all of them. And having indigenous colleagues participating in data collection, conversations, and case studies, I think that should continue and not simply be forgotten, not only in terms of the greater effectiveness of measures that may be put into practice in Brazil, but also and especially in terms of the way of looking at anthropology and collaborative research. I'll also talk about the case studies developed by the Meridional Brazil team, in which I was directly involved with my colleague Deborah Macedo. And well, that's what I had. Thank you very much for this new stage of near completion. We actually completed it in November, and this is the completion ritual that we're now having, so to speak. Thank you. Thank you, Maria.
Assim, a gente que aconteceu, digamos, pouco no percurso
during the research,
a gente esteve organizando
we were
equipes,
organized into 4 teams, 4 main teams,
numa lógica de organização
based
regional.
on a sort of a regional organization rationale. So we were split into South and Southeast Brazil with the Meridional team, the Central team with the Midwest and the south of the Amazon, and to the north of the Amazon. So each research team was responsible for carrying out 2 case studies as part of our missions. And what we're going to do now is to present, I mean, each one of the teams, and of course the teams worked in different ways. They had to work at short notice in the entire country, remotely, and each team had to organize themselves around a series of resources and limitations that were completely different. So each team will now present the results of these case studies and share their experience. We'll start with the Midwest region. That was coordinated by Amanda Horta. And before I give the floor to her, I want to thank the IT and communications team and the Extension Studies team of the Public Health College that made it possible for us to be having this conversation and presenting this seminar. So, Amanda, over to you. Thank you, Jose, and good morning, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here with so many colleagues to look at the results of the case studies that were produced during the year 2020 by the PARI teams. I'm Amanda Horta, and I had the pleasure to coordinate the team that we called Central Brazil and Amazon, with researchers that worked in Tocantins, Mato Grosso, and Amazon, with the different peoples and territories. The team that I coordinated produced 2 case studies. One of them was focused on the PEP, which are the Pinege guardians that were responsible for maintaining and implementing autonomous sanitary barriers in strategic points of the territory. Another case study presents the responses to the pandemic led by indigenous women based on a network of relations that was created by the indigenous individuals comprising our team. So this is a cross-sectional case study that talks about the healthcare practices adopted by these women living in such different territories based on the interest of indigenous researchers in connecting their own experiences and jointly discussing them. And since we were not able to put together a sample or a group of women representing the indigenous women that participated in the research, we decided to present to you a bit of our case study about the PEP, the Pinagé Guardians. This case study is available on the platform, and it's called Struggle, Life, and Pandemic in the Pinagé Land. And it was led by a large team of researchers. And for this presentation, I'd like to invite the first two authors of the text, Sheila, a researcher at PARI and a master's student, and Julia Rivera, a researcher with a master's in social anthropology and a professor. So I'll give you the floor, and I'm going to share with you a slide, and please feel free to start.
Bom dia.
Good morning.
Todos. Eu sou Sheila Pinagé.
Sheila
Sou
Pinagé.
Da escola PEMCRO.
I'm a professor at the PEPCRO school
Universidade Federal de Goiás.
and a master's student at the Federal University of Goiás. I also want to introduce my fellow indigenous researcher colleagues. I'm also an indigenous individual. Oscar, Diana, and others who helped us carry out this project with Professor Odilon and the others, Professor Amanda. We walked this path together. And our intention was to study the different responses to COVID-19, to the pandemic. So thank you for the invitation. And, well, the first thing that we did we had lore about diseases that had almost wiped out the Pinagé ethnicity. There were only 50 Pinagé individuals left at the end of the 18th century. So the Pinagé population has a record of these diseases that almost wiped out the entire Pinagé population in Brazil. And these memories started emerging here and there, and the leaders of the Pinagé population in Brazil. The population is located at the center of the country, and we started to see that the disease was spreading across the country and coming to the neighboring municipalities. And that's when we, PANI, decided to join forces at the beginning of 2020 when the pandemic was already surrounding us,
começamos a se
we
preocupar,
were
criamos
quite
as
concerned,
primeiras
and
barreiras
we created the
sanitárias.
first sanitary
Então, as
barriers.
barreiras
So the
sanitárias, ela
sanitary
foi
barriers were
criada
created
pelos
by
próprios
the
panis,
Pani, the indigenous
nós indígenas,
leaders,
lideranças,
with
por
the
incentivo dos
assistance
mais
of
velhos, anciãos,
the
porque
elderly.
já nas memórias já tinha essa doença, e com
We
medo
were
de nós
concerned that
perder
we
nossos queridos, nesses
might
entes, perder
end
mais
up
famílias,
losing
e começamos
our
a
people
se
to the
preocupar,
disease,
porque
and
nós via nas
we were quite concerned
televisões,
because
em
we
rádios, fake news
were
também, que
watching the
falava que nós todos
TV, the
íamos morrer.
radio, and
Então nós
also
criamos
lots
a
of
barreira
fake news saying
sanitária,
that
de
we
ninguém
were all
entrar,
going to
ninguém
die.
saía para as
So that's
cidades.
when we created the sanitary
Então nós
barriers, and no
começamos
one
a se
could
preocupar mais
go
e
out
criamos a
or
barreira
come
sanitária
into the
indígena
cities.
Pinagé, com os
And
pontos, vários
then we
pontos
set up
principais de
several
saída da aldeia para a
points of
cidade.
departure
Então, o
from
nosso
the village
território,
to the
a
city.
Pinagé, ele está
Our
dentro
territory, the Pinagé
de
territory,
várias
is
denominações de
inside
municípios,
several
né?
different
Então, o nosso
municipalities,
espaço é muito
but our
pequeno para que nós,
territory is
a nossa mata já
pretty
é
small.
pequena, já tem pouca
The
casa,
forest is small,
nossos rios
with
já
only a
temos
few
de peixe,
houses.
porque
We don't
existe
have a lot of fish
construções
in the river because there's
hidrelétricas.
a
Então,
hydropower
o
plant
nossa
in the
alimento que a
river.
gente busca, às vezes, é na cidade para
So we
completar a
usually
nossa
have to go to the
renda,
city to
porque a nossa renda principal
bring
é a nossa
food
roça comunitária. A
to
nossa
our homes.
roça que
Our main
veio
source
nesse
of
momento
income
de
is our
com uma plantação de mandioca,
communal
plantação
plantation,
de batata, milho.
where
Então fez com que
we
nós ficasse mais na
grow
aldeia.
maize
E a
and
doença
other
no
vegetables.
passado, ela
So
refletiu
we basically stayed
o
in the
presente.
village,
Então
and
fez com que a doença tardou a entrada na aldeia. Ela não teve
this
grande,
prevented
não
the
entrou
disease,
com,
the
não
barriers.
deixou morte até
Our
hoje. Nós
measures
estamos em 2022. Não teve nenhum
helped us
caso grave
prevent
que
deaths.
pudesse
We
sair
haven't
da
had
sua
any
aldeia
deaths
para o
so
hospital.
far.
Então tivemos todos
We had
os
no
cuidados.
severe
Pessoas
cases
que nós
that
se
required
preparamos
us to
como
leave
os
the
PEPCAAN
village
agindo
and go to a
e nós
hospital.
vem agindo em momentos
So we really
de mobilização. Então a barreira ela foi
focused
criada
on
nesse sentido de guardar todos. Então nós todos
creating
somos
these barriers
templo. Então nós
to
somos
safeguard
guardiões da
everyone.
nossa vida, da nossa natureza. Então as
We're
barreiras
all
sanitárias ela
We're
veio
all guardians of
para diminuir
life
o
and
fluxo
nature.
de indígenas
So these sanitary
dentro da cidade, porque a
barriers
doença não estava na aldeia, a doença estava na cidade. Então a gente tinha que cuidar o que estava na aldeia e trancar todas as
were
portas de
implemented to
entrada. E assim
decrease
nós conseguimos.
the
Hoje nós não,
traffic of
os casos foi
indigenous
leves, né?
individuals
Os casos
into the
foi
city because
bastante
that's where the disease was.
cuidado.
And
E também a gente
we
já
were
se
successful
preveniu
in that.
antecipadamente.
We had
Quando
only
veio
mild
já
cases,
a doença, quando
and
veio para perto de nós já começamos a se
when the
medicar.
disease finally
Já
arrived,
começamos a se medicar.
we started
as mulheres, ela
taking
teve esse
medicine.
cuidado. Quero agradecer a todos,
I appreciate the
por essa
opportunity of
oportunidade de apresentar
talking
pouco.
about our
Obrigada.
experience. Thank you.
Bom dia a todos. Nesse
Hello,
belíssimo
good morning.
encontro virtual
And
internacional
this is
tratando
a
sobre as
beautiful
percepções indígenas
international meeting
referente ao atual cenário que se
discussing
encontramos
the
com relação à
indigenous
pandemia.
experiences in the pandemic.
Bem, sou Júlio Gambeira Pinagé,
Júlio
professor da Escola
Pinagé,
Indígena
professor
Território.
at the
Vou aqui
Tegator School,
apresentar pouco do
and
trabalho
I'm here
desenvolvido, né, nesse
to talk
projeto que a
about
gente vem desenvolvendo.
our
Bem,
project.
antes disso, agradecer os PANI, né, que
I
participaram
want to thank
de desenvolver essa pesquisa. Foi Diana Mjog,
Diana
Pinagé, que é Vanimé, Sheila
Sheila,
e eu, Júlio Gambeira.
and
E também agradecer
other
a equipe de
colleagues, and I also want to
colaboradores,
thank
nas
the team
pessoas
of
de Amanda Horta e Odilon Moraes.
collaborators on behalf
E
of
agradecer
Amanda
também
Horta and
principalmente
Odilon
os
Moraes,
anciões que contribuíram muito
and
para
also
essa
the
pesquisa, que é o
elderly.
Além,
Our
que já nos
deepest and
deixou agora
heartfelt thanks to
recentemente,
to our elders
Raimundo, que tem, pronto. Então essas
that
pessoas
really
contribuíram muito para
contributed
a elaboração deste trabalho de pesquisa
our
referente
research
às epidemias passadas
about
e
the
a
past
pandemia atual.
epidemics and the current pandemic.
Essa forma, essa metodologia que
The
conduziu a nossa pesquisa
methodology
diante da
adopted by
situação que
our
encontramos
research
e o ritual de PEMCAR
and the
ela
PEPGOG
é um
ritual
ritual que o Apinagé pratica, mas
is
hoje ela não acontece
ritual
porque não tem
carried out by
senhora
Pinagés,
específico que conduz esse
but
ritual.
not
Mas
anymore
toda a sua
because there's
forma,
no
seu
one to
conceito,
conduct the
suas
ritual
ideias,
anymore.
seus pensamentos,
But
existem todos os componentes
its
ritualísticos do país.
ideas and its
Então, com
components
esse
require
conceito ainda acontece em todos os momentos rituais no
PARI
país.
ritual
Apinagé.
components.
Então,
So,
pegando esse conceito,
based on that
o
concept,
Apinagé, Pani, vem atualizando em
Apinagés have
tempos
been
e situações atuais, como
applying
a
this to
epidemia
past
passada
and
e
current
a pandemia
situations,
atual, que
such
é a
as the
COVID-19.
past and
Com
current pandemic,
isso, o Apinagé
and
já
with
tiveram
that, the
experiência
Apinagés
e com isso pegaram o conceito, sua forma, daí
decided that
refletiram
the only
que a
way
única forma de poder se
to
fortalecer,
strengthen
se
themselves
manter organizado,
and to organize
tendo uma
themselves
visão
around
ampla
this
sobre a situação
situation
que
that
ocorre
occurs
externamente, que
externally
ocorre
and
internamente. Com isso,
internally
o Apinagé teve esse
is to
conceito
adopt this
de estar
concept
trabalhando,
and acting
agindo em prol de muitas situações que ocorrem.
to counter
Uma delas,
the
principal,
existing situations, especially the virus.
Então, com isso, o Apinagé
So,
se organizou e enfrentou
with that, the
essa pandemia.
Apinagés
Então,
could
esse ritual,
face the
PEMCAR,
pandemic.
ela
So this
é
ritual, the
processo de conhecimento
PEPCOG,
entre os
is
rituais, Pani.
a
O ritual
process
agora,
of knowledge
é o
exchange.
nome que
PEP
designa polícia guarda,
designs,
mas também ela é
defines
caminho para
a
indicar
guardian,
como o
but
Apinagé
it's also
pode refletir,
a way to
criar,
identify how
organizar
Apinagés can
sua forma de
create
organizar
and
a sua
organize
ciência,
their
cultura,
science,
língua,
culture,
história, a língua
the
materna,
mother
principalmente a
tongue,
sua
and their
origem e
origin.
história. Isso
And
ela vem à tona e vem se
And
articulando
this has come
e se
to
organizando.
existence and has been
Então, dessa
organized and
forma, o
is being
Apinagé,
articulated. So the
com
Apinagé
essa sua ciência
has its own
própria, tem
essence,
a sua
its
visão
own
própria,
view,
que consegue
with
visualizar
which it is able to
qualquer
see any
situação
situation
e enfrentar.
and face it.
Então, com
So
isso,
with
esse
this,
conhecimento, essa
this
ciência, ela
knowledge
é
and
viva
science
no
is
Apinagé
alive
e
in the
ela é
Apinagé,
real.
and it is
Então, com
real.
isso,
And with
demonstramos
that, we
pouco
demonstrated a
na
bit
pesquisa e também aqui
in
na
the
nossa
research
fala.
and also in our
No
words here.
entanto, a participação do Apinagé em questão
So
de
the
epidemia
participation
e
of the
pandemia
Apinagé
atual é
regarding
inédita, porque
epidemic
o
and
próprio
pandemic
Apinagé
that we are
retrata
facing
pouco dessa epidemia
is
passada e pandemia atual.
happening for
E
the
é
first
muito
time because
importante que
it
o Apinagé, como indígena no Brasil,
talked about
está
previous pandemics and the current pandemic. And it's
relatando,
very important that the Apinagé, as an
narrando,
indigenous
sendo
group in Brazil,
protagonista
is
da sua própria
reporting,
ciência, da sua própria
narrating.
realidade nesse
It is
contexto
being
de
a
pandemia.
protagonist of its own
Porque é muito
science and its own
importante que
reality
o
within this
indígena,
context
ou
of
principalmente o
pandemic.
Apinagé, está
It's very
pensando sobre a
important for the
situação,
indigenous
está
peoples, especially
refletindo
the
sobre o que
Apinagé,
ocorre
that
mundialmente.
they are thinking
E
about the
isso
situation, they are
ajuda,
reflecting
e
upon what is
isso
happening worldwide,
faz com que o povo
and this
Apinagé
helps,
reflita mais sobre
and
a
this makes
situação,
it
como
so the
muitos
Apinagé peoples
autores
can further
intelectuais
reflect on the
acadêmicos
situation,
da universidade retratam,
as
como
many
você
authors,
bem
many
sabe,
intellectuals, many people of
deles,
academia
Davi
uh,
Penalva,
are
Jesse
picturing this, as
Baniba,
you well know.
Daniel Mudurucum e assim muitos
Davigo
outros
Penalma, one
indígenas
of them, Jesse
refletem sobre
Baniba, and
essa
also
questão
Daniel Muruku, and
ambiental
many
e
other
social.
indigenous
Então,
peoples are
com
also
isso, o
reflecting on this
Apinagé
issue of the
também está
environment and the
mostrando e
social and
demonstrando a
environmental issues. So with
preocupação
this, the
e o
Apinagé
interesse do
peoples
cuidado
are also
da
showing and
sanidade
demonstrating the
humana,
concern and
principalmente seu
interest
espaço
in
territorial, porque
caring
tudo isso tem a ver com
for
essa
human
questão
health,
de pandemia. Se
and
não
especially in its
cuidar,
territorial space, because all
pode
of
ter
this is related to
consequências
the matter of
presentes,
pandemic.
não futuras.
that if we do not
o futuro
care,
as consequências
we
dos
can
atos
have
irregulares.
present consequences,
Então, com
not
isso,
future consequences, but
o
because the future
conceito de
consequences
tempo
will be
real
the
nos traz
result
isso.
of
Ela tem
irregular
o
activity.
conceito
So the
básico de
concept
preocupação
of
de
PIPCAC brings
cuidado
that to
de
us.
agora.
It has a basic
Porque
concept
quando
of concern
chegar
and
o
care
momento
for the
de
present,
situações graves,
because
a gente já
when
está
time comes
pouco
for grave
preparado,
situations, we
pouco
will be
imunizado para poder
somewhat
enfrentar uma
prepared,
série
somewhat
de
immunized to
situações
face
drásticas como a
a
pandemia.
series of drastic
Então, por isso,
situations as the pandemic.
hoje,
With this,
na
today,
ciência, no
in
conhecimento, na
science,
sabedoria
in
Pinagé,
knowledge, in Pinagé
o
wisdom,
PEMCAL
the
é uma das
PIPCAC is
ciências
one of the
essenciais
essential
para o
sciences
pensamento,
for
para a reflexão,
thinking,
para a
for
filosofia
reflections, for
Paninha
the
Pinagé.
Pinagé
Então, é uma das
philosophy.
formas
So
do
it's one of
Pinagé
the
criar
ways
suas próprias
through which the
ciências.
Pinagé creates its own
E muito
science.
obrigado.
And thank you.
gente.
Hello, everyone.
Essa apresentação.
That was the
Agradecer
presentation. I'd like to
Júlia, Sheila.
thank you, Julio and
Prazer
Sheila.
estar com
It's
vocês.
always a pleasure listening
José,
to
volto
you.
a palavra para ti.
Jose, I pass the
Pra
floor
gente
back to you
continuar
so we
o
can
evento.
continue the event.
Obrigado, Amanda.
Thank you,
Júlio, Sheila.
Amanda, Julio, and Sheila.
É fascinante
It is
ouvir,
fascinating to hear you.
muito importante
It's
também que
also very
vocês,
important
mesmo
that
virtualmente,
you,
estejam aqui na
even
Faculdade de
virtually, are
Saúde
here with us
Pública,
at the School of Public Health,
falando com essa sabedoria,
talking
com
with
essa
such
clareza
wisdom
para as
and
pessoas
clarity
do campo
to
da saúde,
everyone
né?
that works in healthcare.
Um dos aprendizados
That's one of the
grandes que
huge
eu acho que
learnings
o
or
campo da saúde
takeaways
pode ter
that the health
dessa
sector can
pandemia,
take
aprender a
away
ouvir,
from this,
né? Outros,
learning
os
to
múltiplos
listen
saberes.
to others
Eu
that
vou
have
passar a palavra
multiple
agora
knowledges
à
and
professora
wisdoms. I'm going to
Spence
pass the floor
Pimentel
to Professor Spencer
para
Pimentel
nos
so
falar
that
pouco e apresentar
he can talk to us a little bit and
trabalho da equipe
present
Nordeste.
his
Então,
team's
Spence.
work in the Northeast. So, Spencer, good morning, good afternoon to those who are listening to us from other locations. Our team from the northeastern region of Brazil gathered indigenous researchers and non-indigenous researchers from at least 6 Brazilian states. Our region has a very diverse reality of situation. We have indigenous urban populations in regions where they live with non-indigenous and have so for 500 years, which is the case of Bahia, where many of us live, to indigenous who are in voluntary isolation in the state of Maranhão. In the northeastern region, our work in this research had as a starting point very important articulation that had already started in the first semester of 2020 between indigenous groups, researchers, and civil society institutions. So we started this articulation to build our team and also to think of some of the main themes that we would work on. As our researchers are going to show, it was from this articulation that several of the actions came forth, those actions that involved the indigenous women's, as Natalie and Giuliani will report, and also to look for data to obtain independent information about the social control, as our colleague Alexandre will explain. And finally, we also gave special attention to the threats to the indigenous territories that were strengthened during this period. And Tainara will going to talk to us about this. She's from Maranhão, which is a state that is located between the semi-arid, the Amazon region, and where the indigenous lands are especially threatened by organized crime. And this has not stopped, did not stop during the pandemic. We are now facing the second year of pandemic in the northeastern region, where we have some of the lowest human development areas in the world, in the country, and areas with many floods and droughts. In the average of our country, about 70% of the population depends exclusively on public health and public education. In the Northeast, this is an even higher number. In the case of the indigenous groups, they must rely on quality public health services. Therefore, the research that we are presenting can effectively result in important contributions for the future for the improvement of these public policies based on mobilizations of the community that are exemplary for the set of Brazilian population, as you will see. So I would like to invite Nathalie and other colleagues to, and then we will see a video by our colleague Alexandre. My name is Rutiane from the Pataxó, from the southern Bahia territory.
Então, extremo sul da Bahia, na conhecida Costa do Descobrimento.
I have majored in
Eu
economics
sou
from the
formada em
University of
economia pela
Bahia, and I'm the
UFBA,
General Secretary from the
sou
Indigenous
graduada
Peoples
em
of Bahia.
Direito também pela UFBA,
I begin
e
by
estou
talking
como secretária-geral
about
do
our people because
Movimento
that's
Amigo dos Povos e
exactly
Organizações Indígenas
the
do Estado da
great
Bahia.
partnership that we had with the
Eu
research.
inicio minha fala falando sobre o Mucoíba,
Both me and
foi
Nathalie,
exatamente essa grande
we are also from
parceria
the
com a pesquisa.
National
Tanto
Association
eu
that has
como
been
Nathalie,
previously
nós também
working with
estamos da
Coiba.
ANAI, né, que é da Associação Nacional de Ação Indigenista, que já estava fazendo um trabalho anteriormente junto com o Mucoíba
Regarding
em
Purici
relação
bulletins
a
to monitor
boletins,
COVID.
né,
We
de
have identified
acompanhamento
these
ao Covid,
areas.
né? A gente identificou que a CESAI não estava tendo atualização dos dados no estado da Bahia.
We're not
pelo menos,
having
que é
their
o
data updated, at least
nosso
in
foco, e
Bahia,
a
which is
gente
our
começou
focal point,
também
and so we
a fazer
began
esse acompanhamento, que
to
casou
monitor
muito
this
quando
data, which really
iniciou a
came
pesquisa, né?
to
Que é essas
convergency with
parcerias
your
com essas
research, which is these
instituições.
partnerships with
Na nossa
institutions.
equipe estava
In
também
our
mais
team,
dois
we
outros
also had
indígenas,
two
né?
other
Vanessa
indigenous
Pataxó
persons, Vanessa
e
Pataxó
Jéssica Tupinambá.
and
Então,
Jessica
também,
Tupinambá,
a
who
gente
are
focou nosso
also,
trabalho no sul,
and
extremo
we
sul da
focused
Bahia. A
our work on the
gente
extreme south of Bahia.
voltou também a nossa pesquisa no
We
PARI-c em
also
relação a esse
took our
recorte, né?
research
Que é
to this
onde tem, né, mais 70% da população
excerpt
indígena
of
no
the
estado da
population, where
Bahia.
we have more than
São
70%
três
of the
grandes
indigenous
povos,
population of
com
Bahia.
Pataxó,
We have
Pataxó
three
Rani
large
e
indigenous
Tupinambá,
peoples,
com diversos
Pataxó,
territórios,
Tupinambá,
tanto na zona litorânea como na
with
zona
several
de
different
mata e de
territories, not
serra,
only in the
e
coast, on the coast,
comporta
but
também
also
essa maior
in the
quantidade de
forest
povos indígenas
and mountainous
numérico, né?
region. And it is
Numérico.
also where we have the
Isso, então, a
most
gente focou
number of
também nosso
indigenous
trabalho
peoples in terms of numbers.
em
So we
relação
also
a esses
focused
povos que
our
foram
work
os primeiros atingidos pelo Covid no
on
estado da
these
Bahia
peoples
e os
who
que foram mais
were the
atingidos
first
também
ones
por
affected
estar
by COVID in
em
Bahia
regiões de mais
and the ones that were
vulnerabilidade em relação
most
à área
affected in
de
regions of greater
contato e de questão
vulnerability
turística
regarding
também.
the areas
A
of
gente teve
contact
recorte no nosso
and
estudo de dados em
tourist
relação às
as well.
mulheres, por
We
entender
had
também a sobrecarga
a part of
dessas
our
mulheres
study focused on
nessa
women
época
because we
pandêmica,
understand the
né?
overload
Que ainda
on these
vivemos.
women
Então, a
during
gente
times of
teve essas
pandemic
relações
that we are
com as
still going through.
lideranças, com
So
caciques, com profissionais de
we
saúde.
had these
A gente fez
relations with
esse
leaderships,
diálogo
with
com elas,
indigenous leaders, with
conversando,
healthcare.
das nossas
We carried out
entrevistas,
this dialogue
exatamente
with these
para
different
entender
persons
também
in our
a
interviews so
visão
that
dessas
we could
mulheres, né?
understand
Em relação ao nosso
these
estudo de
women's
caso,
points
que
of
foi
views
o nosso
regarding
maior trabalho. A gente fez
our
também
case
notas sobre
studies. We
o
also
turismo lá em
made
Cura Vermelha,
notes
né,
on
sobre o
tourism
Covid, e
in
sobre também
that region and
educação.
also
Então, assim,
education.
a
So,
nossa equipe, por ser só
because
de
our
mulheres
team
também,
was
né,
a
a equipe
women-only team
que trabalhava na Bahia,
working in
4
Bahia,
mulheres,
so
a
we were
gente
4
focou
women,
também
we also
nossos
focused on
esforços
our
também
efforts
em
on discussing
discutir como
how
essas
these
mulheres
women
também tiveram sua
had their
atuação no tempo de
worked
pandemia.
during the times of pandemics.
Obrigada, professor
Thank you,
Spence.
Professor
Obrigada,
Spence.
Ruth. Bom
Thank you,
dia a
Huchi. Good
todos. É um
morning. It's a
prazer estar
pleasure to
participando do encontro
participate in
final
this
e
final
termos, então,
meeting
mais essa oportunidade para
and to present
apresentar
to
os
you the
trabalhos
work
que
that we
desenvolvemos
developed
desde esse grande
in
projeto
this
que é a
large
PARI-c.
project.
Como o Ruth
As
acabou de
Huchi
falar,
just
né,
said,
junto com a gente
we
tinha
also
também
had
duas
with us
outras
two other
pesquisadoras, mais especificamente
researchers,
na
more
equipe
specifically
Bahia.
in the Bahia
E
team.
além dos
And in
trabalhos
addition to the work
apresentados em
presented
comum, né, com a
jointly
equipe
with the
Nordeste, coordenada
Northeast
pelo
team,
professor Spence,
coordinated by
e
Professor
como o Ruth
Pensy, and
acabou
as
de
Huchi
mencionar,
just said, we
desenvolvemos três
developed
tipos
3
de
types of
trabalhos, que
works,
são as
which were
duas
the 2
notas,
notes
já mencionada
mentioned
por
already by
Ruth. A
Huchian.
primeira
The
nota
first one
focalizou
focused on
o impacto,
the
né, do
impact of
turismo em tempos de
tourism at the
pandemia
time
no
of
território
pandemic in the
Pataxó de Coroa
Pataxó
Vermelha.
territory of
No caso
Coroa
aqui,
Vermelha,
destacando os impactos
highlighting the
econômicos
economic
devido à
impact
falta do
due
turismo,
to the
né, mas
lack of
também os riscos de
tourism, but also
contaminação
the risk
na
of
volta às
contamination
atividades,
in returning
né?
to
E a
normal
segunda nota
activities.
se
And the
debruçou
second
mais
note focused more
especificamente sobre a
on
educação escolar em
school
tempo de
education at
pandemia,
times of
na
pandemic,
qual alertamos
in which we
para o fato de
warned
que,
about the
além da
fact of the
inviabilidade
lack of
de
viability
sustentar
of
uma educação
sustaining remote
remota, a
education.
pandemia
The
ressaltou
pandemic
problemas já
highlighted
existentes, como
existing
a
problems as
precariedade
the
ou a
precarious
ausência de
nature,
equipamentos
lack of
escolares, né, além dos prédios
school
escolares,
equipment in addition to school
considerando o acesso à
facilities,
internet,
especially
e a
considering internet
precariedade também
access,
do transporte
and how
escolar,
precarious
que
school
fez
transportation
muita
was,
falta neste
which
tempo de pandemia, justamente para levar as atividades devido à
lacked
falta
greatly
de
during times of
internet para alguns
pandemic,
alunos. E a precariedade
especially
dessa
concerning
atuação dos
taking students
professores
to where they could
indígenas
have
está
access to
atualmente
internet,
em
and
pauta
also
aqui no
to the
estado da
work of
Bahia.
indigenous teachers. We also participated in 2 videos. The first is the health of the land, looking at Pataxó women on and the COVID pandemic and the reflex on their lives, their relations with the earth. That was carried out by Rolinda Muniz, who's an indigenous movie maker from the Pataxó peoples, and it complemented a case study about the impact of the pandemic amongst women, about which I'll speak a little bit more shortly. And the second video, Between Disease and Cure, in the Serra do Padeiro region, which is the Tupinambá indigenous territory. It was made by Glicéria Tupinambá to show how the religious calendar in the region was affected by the pandemic and what the strategies that the communities took were to maintain these festivities. So going back to the first case study, the first video was complementary to the case study, which was our stronger work on the impact of COVID and the protagonism of the region's indigenous women. These are the maps so that our participants can see, and we divided this case study in three large parts. It's important to highlight that we interviewed indigenous women of various profiles and ages, and that these women have been working in various fronts since the very beginning of the pandemic to prevent propagation of the virus, especially considering the inadequate stance of the government to protect the indigenous peoples. So they also opened up new fronts, as for example, manufacturing of masks. So in this first part, we focused on the impact. The second part, we described how these women mobilized quickly to face and to find ways to minimize the effects of the pandemic. And the third part, the indigenous women showed that the indigenous health system cannot be separate from the traditional knowledge and wisdom. So they also highlighted the importance of the demarcation of the land at that moment. So with this case study, we looked to make the women's proposals more visible, more specifically in the south and extreme south of Bahia, and how these responses can assist and be translated into public policies that are concrete for indigenous health. These are some of the women. Thank you. I know the time is very short, so we always try to reduce our words. Thank you for your attention. We're going to pass the floor to Líriam Ribeiro, who is going to talk on behalf of Maranhão. We would also have Tainara Guajajara, our indigenous researcher there, but she had a problem with her internet connection. Good morning to everyone. I would like to thank you for being able to participate in this moment, and also the project, which was extremely rich. It was a very interesting experience, especially with the women of the Guajajara peoples of the northern region of the state of Maranhão. I'm from UFBA. I am carrying out my doctorate in anthropology, and I have also worked for 5 years in this Institute for the Society and Nature, of which I currently work as a consultant in that region with the Guajajara and also the Alaguajá. So during this time, we carried out work jointly with Tainara Carajuba, who is a leader. She represents the articulation of indigenous women of Maranhão, and also is finishing her graduate program in health, working in nursing. She works with indigenous health. We also had support of Genilson Jajajara, who's an indigenous movie maker, a photographer, who greatly collaborated with us in the notes. So throughout this project, we carried out 3 field notes that really pictured or depictured the protagonism of these peoples in face of protecting their territory in the state of Maranhão, in the indigenous lands of Guaru and Pinaré. And so Tainara, with Gemilson worked with interviews on protection and surveillance of land at the times of COVID-19. So in this note, we were able to bring together reports from the guardians of the forest, from the Guajajara and Icapó people. During a time they faced more closely, during a time that was very delicate, which is the time of COVID-19, in protecting their territory in territorial surveillance. So they did not allow at any point, they did not stop carrying out this work at any moment. So if before COVID they had more support from other institutions as FUNAI, as IBAMA, this was a time during which they saw themselves to be more alone, and they came together as a group and articulated with other peoples to protect the Akaru indigenous land, which is a shared indigenous territory between two different indigenous peoples. So in this note, we also counted on the support from João Guajajara, who's part of a brigade, and who also talked about the cases of fires during that time and all of the work they carried out. On another note, we highlighted the protagonism of women, the Awa and Guajajara women, in environmental management of their territories. So it was very important at that time for them, and it was a moment during which they became even stronger in shared work with men, and also in work for internal strengthening of these women with the Council of Women, in articulating actions amongst the territories, not only in their own regions, but in all indigenous lands of Maranhão. So it was a time for them to form politically and to strengthen themselves at the time of the pandemic. Another activity that was carried out regards the rituals. This was a textual and a photographical work by Genilson, who really characterized the Mandiocaba ritual during this time of pandemic. And that was a time that was crucial for the Guajajaras, and a time of great questioning, because these are festivities that involved a lot of people coming together. And during the pandemic, we also always heard that we could not bring people together. So they saw themselves at a time of a lot of reflection, because these festivities are essential for the strengthening of health, for the Guajajara bodies, for their relations, and also for establishing these relationships with the beings that comprise their territories. So this note speaks a bit about that.
So it's basically these three notes that we developed in the north of Maranhão. And we also produced a video about the Bolivian side, about the protection of the territory in that region during the pandemic. Thank you. Thank you, Lirian. Tainara was able to join us. Are you there? Good morning. Tainara, I live in the Karu indigenous land, and I was part of this team as an indigenous researcher for PARI-c. And to me, it was really important because I was able to learn and contribute along with the team that gave me this opportunity. And I can only thank them because this really expands our knowledge and gives visibility to the struggle undertaken by our people. And it was very important, especially for us indigenous women, because we were able to show that during the pandemic, we were also working towards providing this protection along with the guardians, and we worked jointly in the territories. And it was a really hard period for us
durante esse período de pandemia, a gente teve que enfrentar
because
muitas
during
coisas,
the
né?
pandemic
A
we
gente teve
had
que enfrentar aí várias leis, várias
to deal with
PECs, né?
several laws
Entraram
and
em
bills,
votação. A gente teve que, mesmo mediante a essa pandemia, né, que foi
and
período
even
muito difícil
during
para
the
nós, a
pandemic,
gente
which
teve
was a
que
really hard
atuar
period for us,
dentro da proteção
we
territorial. A
had
gente não deixou
to
de
continue to
fazer,
protect
claro, que
the
seguindo
territory,
sempre o
and
protocolo, né, usando
we
máscaras, álcool em
were
gel,
always
mas a gente nunca deixou de
aware of the
fazer,
need
porque
to
a gente
follow
viu
the
que
healthcare
quando no
protocols,
momento
but
que a gente
we never
descansou
really stopped
pouco,
protecting
né, as
our territory
invasões
because
aumentaram na entrada de
at
madeireiro,
the
né,
times
de
that we did that,
pescadores.
several
Então,
unlawful
aconteceu
activities would start
atos, né,
occurring.
ilícitos, e a
So
gente
we set
teve
up
que
sanitary
continuar
barriers
fazendo, né?
around
Nós
the
mulheres, a gente
village to
fez as nossas
protect the
barreiras
territory. So
sanitárias
showing
na
this
entrada
work
das
was very
aldeias,
important to
juntamente com o
me
grupo da proteção
because many
territorial.
people are
Então, mostrar
unaware
esse
of
trabalho
our
para mim
struggle,
foi muito
and
importante,
giving
né? Porque
visibility to
muitas
this struggle
essa luta do povo
is
indígena, e dar visibilidade para a
to
luta
resist.
dar
So I want
resistência,
to
continuar
thank you
nessa
for the opportunity.
resistência.
It was
Então,
very
eu quero
important
muito
to
agradecer a
use
oportunidade,
this
dizer que foi muito
opportunity,
importante para mim, né?
and
É a oportunidade
hopefully
que
we'll
me
be
foi
able to
dada,
continue
e que a gente
working
continue, né? Que os
with
organizadores,
observers,
antropólogos
anthropologists,
que fazem parte de
and
toda a equipe
indigenous
indígenas, que é importante a
individuals. It's
participação
really
indígena
important for us to
nesse contexto,
participate
porque a
and
gente
continue
pode
to
falar a nossa
expand
vivência,
this
né? Que
project.
possa cada
It's
dia mais
also
expandir
a way
esse
for us to
projeto,
give
né? Porque é uma
visibility to
forma também
our
de luta,
lore
né? A gente levar
and to
a
our
nossa
lives
vivência,
and
o nosso bem viver,
difficulties
as nossas
around this,
dificuldades,
around
mediante esse contexto
health
de
and
saúde,
other
que é um tema tão
issues.
difícil, né, assim, para nós indígenas, né, traz toda ali uma complexidade, né,
There's a lot of
acerca dos
complexity
rituais,
involved
acerca
in the rituals
nossa
and
visão de
in
como é a
our
saúde.
perspective
Então, é muito
about
importante para
health.
nós, e eu só quero
That's
muito
extremely
agradecer e
important. So
dizer
I really want to say
assim
that
que a gente
I wish
possa,
we
né,
can continue
continuar
our work
trabalho,
and
que a gente possa
continue
desenvolver,
carrying
né,
out
mais
other
outros trabalhos, porque
studies.
isso é muito importante,
That's extremely
acredito,
important, I
para
believe, both
vocês
for
e para
you
nós,
and
né,
for
como
us,
indígena, a gente mostrar,
to show our
né, a nossa
reality. So thank you very much.
realidade.
I
E
also
muito
want to
obrigada.
thank
E agradecer
Lyrian
também a Lilian,
and
né, o
Spence that
que me
gave
deram
me
essa oportunidade.
this opportunity.
Assim,
I
que
really,
eu tenho
really want to
muito que
thank you
agradecer muito, porque eu
because
tenho
I've been
aprendido
learning
muito
a
mesmo,
lot
aprendido muito com esse povo,
from them,
né, com eles,
and
né, e tem expandido assim
this
a
has
minha
been
visão assim para várias
expanding
coisas. Então
my
eu só tenho que
perspective
agradecer, porque só
around
quem
several
ganha,
different
né,
things.
com isso é o meu
Of
povo,
course,
né,
this
porque
is
a partir
to the
do
benefit
momento
of
que eu
our
adquiro
people,
esse
because
conhecimento,
once
de fato
I
eu posso
acquire this
perpetuar
type of
dentro da minha
knowledge, I'll
comunidade.
bring
Então
it
é muito
automatically
importante
to
para
our
mim
communities.
agradecer mesmo todos vocês. Né?
So thank you very
Obrigada.
much for that.
Muito obrigado, Tainara.
Thank
que
you,
bom que
Tainara.
foi possível você
I'm
participar.
glad you were able to participate.
Fantástico. A gente
That's
ter você
fantastic.
diretamente da aldeia. Eu vou agora exibir
So now I'm
aqui
going to show you
do companheiro
a video
Alexandre Pancararu,
from
que
our
não pôde estar
brother
conosco, mas
Alexandre. He was
enviou
not
aqui
able to
vídeo
join us
apresentando
today,
e vai
but he
apresentar
sent
pra
us a
gente
video,
finalmente
and
a
he'll
equipe de
introduce
Pernambuco,
the
tá?
team
Parceiro
from
da equipe de
Pernambuco
e que atuou
that also
também na
worked in
Paraíba.
Paraíba.
Olá a todos, todas,
Hello.
né, todos
It's
nos assistindo.
an
É uma
honor
honra muito grande
to
ter
have
participado
participated
desse
in the
PARI.
PARI project. I'm Alexandre,
Eu sou Alexandre, sou indígena
and
aqui do sertão submédio de São
our
Francisco,
village
em
is at
Pernambuco,
the margins of the
às margens do
San
Rio
Francisco
Grande do
River.
Sul. E a questão, né, que a pesquisa
So,
atendeu aqui, né, no nosso território.
our studies were about the impacts of COVID-19 on indigenous peoples and the solutions.
Vocês estão
Are you able to hear him?
Pesquisa para nós, de vulneração territórios. Esse projeto ele foi muito importante.
So the project was really important because we were able to.
Eu pulei apenas a parte então que ele estava apresentando
I
aqui no
only
PowerPoint,
skipped
que o
that
som dele
PowerPoint
ficava
and that slide.
tá bom? Então volta ele aqui a falar.
Para a gente pesquisar, né, e ver as realidades, né? Porque
look at different realities, because in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were different epidemics inside the pandemic, in terms of violence in the indigenous territories. Indigenous leaders were attacked by people taking profit of the vulnerable situation we were in and threatening indigenous leaders, and that was an eye-opener, this research, in that it shed light on these issues. One of the most important results of this survey for us was to understand that COVID-19 was a foreign element to our peoples and actually to the entire world. But
Mas também podemos ver que houve várias,
we were also able to see that there were several solutions around prevention and avoiding contamination. So we could see how the Capinavá people, for instance, they were able to deal with water. They did not have access to piped water, and they found a solution for that. They also created barriers to prevent people from coming into their territories, and it was also important in disseminating information about this danger. If compared to the statistics, we had few cases of death as a result of our actions, and the research was instrumental in helping us set up prevention measures and opening our eyes to the importance of taking care of not only ourselves, but of people around us. And it also shed light on some of our shortcomings in terms of healthcare services, safety and security, and led us to look for ways to improve these aspects. So I'm really thankful that I could participate in this project and that I was able to produce a few videos, and that I was able to, with this wonderful team, I was able to participate in the survey. So I want to thank everybody, the creators and supporters of this amazing undertaking. The pandemic was also had a huge psychological impact. So in that regard, the survey was also quite comforting. So that's what I had. Thank you very much.
Acho que é isso, então nós tivemos aí
Well,
só uma pequena interrupção
I
no
apologize,
vídeo,
we
né?
had
Foi trecho que estava sem
certain
som, em que
hiccups
ele
in the
estava falando
video.
mais especificamente sobre o trabalho sobre
He
controle
was
social,
talking
né? Que foi
about
feito lá em
what they did in
Pernambuco,
Pernambuco during the part that the video was muted. Alexandre also talked about some of the videos that were produced by our team, and that was a true achievement for us. I think that altogether the PARI study involved at least
pelo menos 18 filmes que eu tenha conseguido contar. Não sei se ainda temos algum para ir ao ar.
18 videos and counting, and 7 from our region alone.
Como estava dizendo Alexandre, poder apoiar
So we're really proud that we were able to produce these materials during such complicated times, and so that the indigenous communities could show what happened in these locations during the pandemic. And they're really diverse locations. We produced videos in the Atlantic forest, in the savanna, and several different locations with a huge diversity of situations that are depicted in the videos. And, well, thank you. Thank you for your participation, and sorry for the technical glitches. Thank you very much. I want to thank our wonderful colleagues from the North and Northeast. As you could see, the PARI-c research
a pesquisa PARI-c fez uma produção enorme de conhecimento,
produced a huge amount of knowledge, especially in the form of text and videos. If you've not yet watched it, we'll send you the link. Actually, it's on YouTube. We'll send the link again for all of the videos produced by our teams and hybrid teams with indigenous researchers and others. And please, if you have any questions or comments or queries, you can use the YouTube platform, and we'll be reading your questions. So now we'll give the floor to the North team that was led by Bruno Marques, who's with us, by me, and Professor Flavia Mello. She's also with us. And I don't know if Bruno wants to say something. Otherwise, I'll give the floor to Flavia. Bruno, well, Jose, I think we should give the floor to those directly involved in the case studies, and if we have time at the end, I'll add my comments. Sure. Thanks, Bruno. So I'll give the floor to Professor Flavia Mello from UFAM. I think the connection dropped. Okay, so in the meantime, I'll start talking about the other case study from the North region that was carried out in the region of Rio Negro. And with that, I'll give the floor to Dulce Moraes. She was one of the researchers in the team, and Fran Baniwa, who was also one of the researchers. You have the floor. Good morning. I'm Dulce Moraes, with a master's in public health from the University of São Paulo. I'm part of the North team, as Jose said, and we worked on indigenous women and the healthcare scenario. I'll give you a brief presentation of our case study, where we set out to understand how the indigenous women around the Rio Negro River responded to the COVID-19 pandemic with a network of lore and knowledge. So we worked with the Federation of Women in the northwest of the Amazon. In terms of our method, we undertook the study during almost 2 years, 2020 and 2021, both in person and remotely. Other studies carried out by us in a partnership with the Institute of Women, and more recently with the Laboratory of Gender, coordinated by Professor Flavia, they were instrumental in the construction of our in-field relations. And I did the in-person field work between February and May 2020. during which period the region was hit by the virus. And after that, with the arrival of the pandemic, Bruno, José Miguel, and me, we started monitoring the women around the Rio Negro region. And as a result of our notes in the PARI project and of our narration efforts, we decided to produce a case study that could benefit their plurality, prioritizing our voices, our texts, and our contextual relations. And that's why I'm going to split my time between myself and with other researchers. So, Fran, over to you.
Fran, estamos contigo. Adolfo, sou eu que vai compartilhar o...
Fran, we're with you. I'll share the video. Yes, go ahead, Fran. Good morning.
Muito bom, né, a gente ter mais contato virtual, né, mais uma rede de pesquisadores, né, indígenas, não indígenas. Trabalho
that we do thinking about our own indigenous peoples. We know that we faced several challenges when we are talking about health. And we have been demonstrating the science that we have regarding indigenous knowledge and wisdom. In the Rio Negro, my name is Fran. I'm one of the 23 peoples that live in the Alto do Rio Negro region, that live in this indigenous land. I worked as a researcher, as an orientator of my colleagues, Elisângela, Miguel, Dulce, in this network of production and knowledge. It was a challenge, and at the same time we had a tool to register and to produce and to speak about our knowledge of our day-to-day and how this disease got to the indigenous peoples. Despite being in the very beginning of Brazil, we were able to be affected by this disease, which is invisible, as was the whole world. So it was Ayuri, it's a collective work in our language. It was great Ayuri regarding case studies. We had to prioritize some themes that were very important and so that we could somehow register, share, try to translate this knowledge for us to take our voices to other instances of a diversity of people and places. I was much more focused on the Sassana indigenous community. I think that I could say that every time I talk about COVID, I feel sadness because we lost many people, we lost relatives, we lost thinkers of other peoples. So it's a mix of feelings, but at the same time, it's very gratifying for us to produce so much text so that somehow we've been able to translate knowledge which was previously oral. We took these voices to written language. So in these issues that I, as a researcher, I place myself not as an anthropologist, but as a person who has and who lives this directly in an indigenous community, to see the situation of COVID arriving, at first being far from it, and at the second moment, monitoring this arrival of the second wave in São Gabriel and how it was a desperate situation. This matter of not knowing how to protect. We had no vaccines, we had no medication, And so the biggest concern of ours was, what now? How can we protect ourselves? We already knew, we had already our knowledge, and we resorted to our pharmacy, which is our forest. For the symptoms, we took medication for fevers, headaches, for body aches. So we had this network of knowledge that we already lived. So we resorted to it to try to protect ourselves from this disease. So how could we organize this knowledge? What is going to go into this case study? What will not? How will we translate it? Sometimes in the Portuguese language, this translation is very complicated. So in addition of going through a very difficult time of witnessing the loss of our relatives, at the same time we felt very well cared for by taking various types of teas, baths with herbs, the blessings that were fundamental for the protection of our bodies. So I went as a researcher into a multifaceted world of knowledge for protection that is invisible, that only I can understand, but the academic world cannot. So it was very challenging to say, I have this protection, and that protection, and when the disease sees me, I'll be in a bubble of protection. So it was very difficult for us to translate that, to put that on paper. And so at the same time, it was, diving into the world of these indigenous blessings to try to find out what COVID-19 in our interpretation was. What would that disease be? What would the appeal of the environment, of rays, thunders, rains? What does all of that have in terms of information in a different language? So it was a lot of things that we were there to extract information from and pass forward. But I think what was the most important thing of all of that, which is once again, we affirm that we indigenous peoples, Maniwa and other peoples, have a unique science which belongs to us as indigenous peoples. The understanding, we have our science of medication, of the blessings, of the interpretation of nature language. So we had all of these other weapons to defend us. So, we could see it in another way and say, well, here's the tool. And we became spokespersons of that moment of the disease, because we would articulate with the Afoí and Elisângela, we could exchange ideas. The Rio Negro campaign we cared for, so we monitored this closely, this mobilization of the indigenous movement. And I think that was very important for us to work with 750 indigenous communities in different regions, and the Rio Negro region itself, in the past it was impossible. So I think the indigenous movement became a huge umbrella, a huge hut regarding the information. So we were also there to build and help in building this information, production of pamphlets, of audios in the 3 different languages, on radio. So we were at the forefront as researchers, but at the same time as indigenous women, as mothers, and as leaders. So we were playing that role that was not only a single role, but several roles with several functions and duties. And at the same time, it was painful for us to hear reports of somebody that lost a relative and not crying with these people. So that was a very painful part of the process, because we didn't really know how to calm people, how to support people. It really moved me a lot as a researcher, as a daughter, as a granddaughter, as a niece, and etc. And so, in this entire construction of the Rio Negro productions, we had enormous production of what this complexity and what the specificities of knowledge and relations are. It's painful, but I think the matter of losses, and we were able to understand what death was, what it means, what the corners of death means. So it was really a mix of feelings, because we were at the forefront as researchers, but carrying out the work, and at the same time we were there, writing down something with a pen, but we were fighting with your knowledge. So I think this advantage, we had an assessment with leaderships, and until now we try to understand what COVID-19 is. What is this invisible disease? And us, somehow, we try to take it according to our knowledge of dreams, of the shamans, of blessings. So I think it's a unique experience that I, Fran, had of being a researcher, Manua, researcher in the Alto do Rio Negro region, also as a woman. And so I think we placed ourselves as people who are at the forefront, guiding the women, translating, speaking. And so I think the name of our project says it all. PARI language, it's a fishing trap. We were able to grasp several pieces of information and knowledge and texts of Brazil as a whole from other relatives of other regions. So we have a lot of information, and I think the result is this knowledge, these networks of knowledge. Perhaps for me and Banil, it's different, but maybe the name changes elsewhere. But at the same time, these invisible beings are the same ones. So we end up having this knowledge that is huge about the indigenous knowledge, indigenous wisdom, information that we take in a very unique manner, but at the same time, abrupt way that we need to break down. So I think it's a beautiful example, I would say. Elisângela said, the oven house. Well, what is this oven house? So Bruno was there, who was the person who was there to help us translate these words. So we would say at the side of the river, and people wouldn't understand what that meant. So we had several other pieces of knowledge and advice and guidance that we had. So I would like to thank the entire team, the people who were coordinating it, the thinking minds for this project to have become a reality. So we are finalizing this with great success, and we hope to continue this partnership and to continue making room for indigenous knowledge and for this science of ours, science of the indigenous peoples. It is by sharing these experiences that we had. It's a pleasure, as it has been in the past years, a pleasure and a privilege to hear you. I'm now going to share a video of other indigenous researchers who are Elisângela da Silva Costa from the PARI-c group. And that's it. One of the most difficult things for the North team had to do with the possibilities of connection. So that's it. I'm going to share Elisângela's video. Can you please let me know if you can see it and hear it? I'm from the PARI indigenous group. My name is Elisângela. I'm from I'm 37. I have 3 kids. I am here to talk to you about the PARI project. The PARI project had as its objective the identification of the indigenous knowledge within the Rio Negro region, especially the way of life and the way of combating COVID-19, which is a disease that has been there since 2020. We indigenous women work a lot in pro of our diversity and in knowledge and the plants. Each leaf that we see, each root, each seed, it has its own life within the force. That is why, and with that, we are able to safeguard life. And the PARI project was made in that way, based on our way of being and living and our day-to-day. So, by using them in various ways, as teas, baths, by smokers, so we can protect ourselves from COVID, because we indigenous peoples and we indigenous women are responsible for safeguarding. And so through this tea, we have been able to safeguard, because we believe that the plants have life, the seeds do as well. We believe that the leaves have life, and that is why we believed greatly that they could also safeguard our lives, the lives of human beings. So the PARI project did that. So we were able to have as our objective describing things that we indigenous people, our oral and practical nature, are in our day-to-day, but we need to write this down so that we can be able to expand this. Thank other countries, thank another country who gave us this opportunity of being able to share, of me being able to share this knowledge with other women. Within the Rio Negro region, we have our way of being. We're 23 indigenous peoples, but we have our own way of life, our own way of co-inhabiting. So COVID-19 made these huge networks, these ties, these vines of safeguarding indigenous life. So through this PARI project, we have been able to show a little bit of our work and our lives in combating COVID-19, to show our day-to-day. I, for example, had the example of writing a knowledge text. We believe that within the Rio Negro, each woman has its own knowledge, its own way of living, its own way of surviving and safeguarding herself, safeguarding her family and territory. So the PARI project gave us this opportunity. So I'd like to thank you greatly for the project, for having been able to write and speak and put on social media this knowledge so it could be transformed into articles, so that a lot of people who do not know our reality or our diversity can read about this, can understand about this, understand that we are intercultural, that we can co-live with this knowledge, and we can safeguard this knowledge. And so the PARI project had this objective. So I would like to greatly thank our colleagues Bruno, the professor, the University of São Paulo, of Public Health, who gave me this opportunity to show this knowledge and to say that we're here within the Rio Negro in favor of life, in pro of life. So with this, I want to sum, to close by saying demarcation now. It just brings me goosebumps, as always, with Fran. And that's it. Now I'm going to pass the floor to Professor I'm sorry, to Professor Flávia Mello. To Professor Flávia Mello from UFAM. Her connection went wrong and now it is back. Good morning once again. Can you see and hear me? Hello? We can see you and hear you. Okay, so I'm not sure up to where you were able to hear me because my connection wasn't the best. But I was talking about our case study and that our work in this region, in this part of the Amazon, going from the Alto Rio Negro to the Solimões and going to Manaus, which is where Professor Rodrigo and I were part of the team. Our team was comprised by me, Professor Rodrigo. I was in Manaus and he was in the city of Tabatinga. Our case study also encompassed these two locations. And so between Manaus and Tabatinga, we have about more than 1,200 kilometers of a distance between the two cities. Tabatinga is in a region known as Alto Solimões region, and we designated a case study exactly that was allocated to these 2 points, the city of Manaus in the Parque das Tribos neighborhood, which has been consolidating for the past 10 years as, a little less than 10 years, maybe 5 to 6 years, it has been consolidating itself as an indigenous neighborhood, and it is known that way because of a political and agency and mobilization for a pluri-ethnical group that has been led especially by indigenous peoples from the Cocama people. So we get to the Alto Solimões region, which is a region that is occupied by the Cocama peoples as well. Here in the Parque das Tribos in Manaus, the researchers were Wanda Wintoto, the more acknowledged leader who's known nationally and internationally, or one of them, and Suni Perpetua, who's a student of teaching and a nurse practitioner, who has protagonized a movement of great visibility for the first healthcare and nursing in Parque das Tribos, but especially to the construction of an ICU and a space to shelter and provide treatment, more intensive treatment in the Parque das Tribos neighborhood. Suni Perpetua Cocama, who's a master's student in the anthropology program of the Federal University of Amazonas. And we also counted on Rodrigo and Gracie Cocama, who live in the Cocama municipality in the Benjamin Constant municipality.
So our study was split around 3 main themes: health and care and territory, with the indigenous women that worked with us. So we worked on 3 notes and 4 videos. 3 of them are very brief, introducing the trajectory of these women, and another in around the Solimões River, based on a conversation with some youths that live in the area. So, one issue has to do with the persistent struggle for the recognition of the Cocama territory. There are other initiatives in the Javari Valley, and those are communities that face lots of conflicts and dispute over territory, but their territory is not recognized according to the Brazilian parameters. There are several issues around the Solimões River area, which is a different region, not only in terms of administrating the indigenous territories in Brazil, but it's a separate administrative region. So that region has several smaller Cocama communities that struggle for different types of recognition of their territories. And Parque das Tribos, which is densely occupied, was developed after the arrival of a Cocama couple in the 1980s. And as of 2013, they also initiated a struggle for recognition of facing a slow legal process and other issues. The first point of connection between the case studies is the mobility, these displacements of Cocama populations between the Solimões River and the Manaus region, and how these struggles to recognize the indigenous land demarcations, how this this struggle allows us to look at the trajectory of women in the Amazonas region and how that connects with the issues that were identified during the pandemic. So what Elisangela and others shared with us is also shared by Gracie Kokama in one of our notes, and Vanda and Sumi, talking about how going back to the rituals of tea and smoking, and how resorting to these lores are a fundamental support that is mainly conducted by women. And it is by looking at the trajectory of these women that we'll see their displacement and the processes of creating and eliminating territories led by Kokama leaders. That's how we start seeing other aspects such as displacements, to give them access to public health care services, but also, as Suni Perpetua, one of our indigenous researchers, she's becoming established in Manaus, and Parque das Tribos, mediated by the leader of the tribe. She was accompanying her mother that had to go to a hospital in Manaus City. That is a very common trip, not only for indigenous, but also for non-indigenous peoples to have access to healthcare treatments and specialized centers. And there were also other generations that came to Manaus to have access to education. So these are very common things to see in the trajectories of indigenous women, but also indigenous men that have to leave their communities and settle in the city of Manaus. Another aspect that involves Manaus and the Solimões River is the fight for the right to indigenous healthcare for people that are not living in indigenous villages. And this is where the discussion about indigenous people living outside of indigenous territories gain force and visibility in Manaus City, because Vanda, one of our researchers, became the first person to be vaccinated in Amazonas, and she focused on that as the North Star of her movement. And like we saw in the case of Rio Negro and in the discussions with Elisangela Barré, this concern that the pandemic brought about in terms of not rendering the other demands and issues invisible. And that's something that the indigenous leaders and researchers also told us in the Northeast region. This concern is also intensely seen in the Kokama gatherings around the Solimões River for recognition of their presence in the city and as a way to produce territories, traditional territories in other contexts, mediated by these movements that involve mining and territory-related conflicts. So that's another very important aspect of our case study. And more recently, we've been seeing with the PARI-c project, we've been seeing how the trajectories of these women align around political engagement. 2022 is election year in Manaus, and Wanda is running in the north region, and Perpetua Suni with more local alliances, so they're both engaged in political organizations to run for an office and focusing on having indigenous women occupy these positions. And with that, they shed light on the lack of spaces for these women and indigenous women, even among the left-wing positions. So we can think about very interesting results from these initiatives. And also in terms of going back to traditional lores, like preparing recipes or growing certain herbs. And now with the engagement in politics. So these were my contributions. Our 3 notes are available on the website, and the video as well, which is quite dense, the video about the Solomons River region, and other videos that were produced with Liza's support. She gave us a lot of technical support. That's what I had, Jose. Thank you. Thank you very much, Flavia. It was really a pleasure to hear how the story unfolds. Bruno, you have a minute. Yes, we had these connection problems and whatnot, so I'll try to be as concise as possible. Good morning. I think that talking about the conditions around the elaboration and content production around these cases, like we were saying before, having access to a phone line and internet connection was a constant challenge in our endeavors. And also another aspect, which is the fact that we were working with people that were in the middle of a fight, often for survival, and also to produce a political response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And while this context provides for a very rich scenario, it's also a pretty delicate scenario, which leads us to think about several issues, ethical issues, and other types of issues. I think that the North team, it has a certain feature to it in that the notes were basically written in first person, like reports or testimonials, and critical thinking, and a huge diversity of different lines of critical thinking, and different ideas of protection emerged across cultural perspectives as well, and care. And this testimonial, I think it's two descriptions and two presentations describing how the networks between indigenous and non-indigenous individuals were formed around the Rio Negro region and in the Parque das Tribos and with the Cocama in Tabatinga region. I think it was collective work, like Fran said, and, well, I think it's not coincidence. It's not out of coincidence that she talked about these baskets of knowledge, which are these ancient lores of women and indigenous people in general. And that's what I had. Thank you. Bruno, you made excellent comments. I also want to thank Flavia. I know that she's having connection issues, so thank you for your efforts. I also want to thank Rafael França from the Public Health College that edited the wonderful video sent by Elisangela. And Maria Paula, now we're going to give the floor to the Southern Brazil team that was coordinated by Maria Paula herself. Over to you. Thank you, Jose. It was a pleasure to listen to all of you. It really rekindles all of our memories and the adrenaline of doing research in face of all of these challenges, because in the last 2 years, we kind of slowed down to focus on case studies. So it was really a pleasure to listen to our indigenous colleagues and also listening to the rest of you about the case studies. In the well, I'll continue to talk about it since I started. As a research coordinator in Brazil, I must say that 2 of the case studies are already published on the platform, and the others will be published by the end of this month. And speaking from the perspective of the Southern Region team that I coordinated with Valeria Macedo, who's also with us, we decided that I would talk about our main findings. The Southern Brazil team involved indigenous and non-indigenous researchers, just like every other team. We were, or rather, we are a team of 24 female researchers, mostly female, some men, and in one case study, we also had 2 additional researchers, collaborating professors, and an additional 6 indigenous collaborators. So in the 2 case studies, in each one of them, we had approximately 30 people involved. The Southern Brazil team focused on 2 case studies. One of them focusing on birth and delivery during the pandemic, and another one discussing social distancing from the perspective of indigenous populations. I'll also mention a 3rd case study, which is about vaccination. It was not the product of the Southern Brazil team. It was rather led by Adriana Atila, Ivana Teixeira, and Anderson Jamark. So I'll present some results of that study. and starting with the study on delivery and birth, which are two separate events, as it were. That's a study that involved individuals from Guarani and Kaingai. And initially, we would also use data from the Manako collective from Xingu, but unfortunately we lost not only a colleague, but also a great indigenous leader in Brazil, Moni, and for obvious reasons, we were deeply saddened. She was also an instrumental person in our study, and it was really impossible to continue with the study involving the Manako data. There's a beautiful note about her if you're interested. So the case study involved data from Guarani and Kaingai people. So with the case studies, and I want to share that with you, the case study, we might consider that COVID-19 was like a doorway that led us to talk about delivery and birth in indigenous women. And the reason I say that is because we did not talk much about COVID-related cases in our study. We know that there is a note about that, about delivery and the death of indigenous women and the transfer of indigenous women to the clinics in urban centers that ended up dying from COVID, waiting to give birth. And that happened not only during COVID. We're talking about COVID because these women were contaminated by COVID, but that happens in some regions around the Xingu where women, way before they reach 40 weeks, they're taken to urban centers for several different reasons, which I will not going into details about because that did not show up in our case study. So combining the data about delivery and birth during the pandemic, the data shows us, well, I listed three main aspects that I want to talk about. First, the midwives' role, the role of traditional midwives. That's a category that we have to place between brackets because they make reference to these people not only as women in the case of our case study, but also male midwives. And during the pandemic, what we noticed was that there was a revival of these practices during the pandemic. This is not to say that they did not exist, but rather that they became central to the discussions as to why these women are being taken to hospital to give birth. And that was a constant discussion in our case study.
During the pandemic, another point is that due to our research, the way it was set up and the methodology in terms of comprising the teams of indigenous researchers, is that we had access on episiotomies, which is data that is very difficult to access, if not impossible, unless we have a research that is focused on that. But where do we begin to raise this data in terms of public data. So there's no way, I mean, what is the way for us to access this data? And in this case study, we were able to do so because during this conversation, these more in-depth conversation, these longer conversations, we asked about this as well. We asked about what happened in the hospitals. And one of the things that was not our initial intention, but something that we always made very clear, that COVID could not obstruct other important data from being raised, as every ethnographic research does, you know, allowed the problems to surge. The episiotomy was one of the great data that came up. Why? Because when these women were reporting about their childbirth and comparing childbirth in hospitals and in the indigenous groups, you know, what they said that what bothered them in the hospital was the cut, and we began to investigate what the cut was. And then by analyzing the data that we had, you know, this did not happen in all of the microregions of our region, but of the data we have of this sample, which is small in terms of quantitative means, but robust qualitatively speaking, it shows that the women who have to deliver babies in the hospital undergo episiotomies. We have maybe one or two women that did not, that were not cut. In other words, the rates of C-sections amongst indigenous women of our group, you know, it's very seldom that we saw C-sections. I don't recall now about this data, but the episiotomy does show up frequently. So as I said in the beginning, COVID was a window for us to have access to all of these issues that were not intentional. We were not looking for this specific data, but only because of our model of research and methodology and the networks of trust, we came across this data, and for them, you know, this came up because this was a huge issue for them. These women who shared their childbirth experience with us. You know, we have several questions that come up related to COVID. For example, the great issue is not having a person to be with them due to the security protocols for COVID. That was not only for indigenous women, but for everyone going to the hospital. So there were no relatives with them. But that, too, was a problem before the pandemic, because oftentimes the women cannot, not for prohibition by the hospital, but because of the access thereto of who goes with them, or the person that these women want with them. Maybe it's an ancient person. They will not be able to intervene or help in childbirth, so they end up not going. So this is something that during COVID happened in an explicit manner, but beforehand it was also part of their day-to-day, perhaps not for the same reasons. In this study of social distancing, we're going to see this in a different way. We can think of a very important duo in terms of these care relations, which is trust. So, at the time of childbirth, you need to have someone you trust with you. In vaccination, you know, I'm going to take a vaccine, and I don't trust the person that says I need to get a vaccine. And in social distancing, about these practices of pertaining to health care and care, they are put into action for a network of trust that will foster better management of the social distancing and social proximity. Regarding childbirth, these are the main topics that I would like to highlight about the episiotomy, to say how much talking about the cut is embarrassing to these women. So that's also something that's important in terms of the ethnographic research, because if it were possible for us to have this data, it is because there was a relationship of trust for them to talk to me about this cut. But it's not something that is spoken of in a direct way. It happened between indigenous women and researchers. And I think above all, that's what I wanted to say about childbirth. In terms of childbirth, this data is still not available on the platform, but it will be shortly. The case study of social distancing was coordinated by my colleague, Valéria Macedo. The two of us coordinated the two case studies together, but we decided that at the time of editing and the final remarks, each one would be responsible for one. So Valéria headed the social distancing case study, which was a topic that came up in the very beginning of our research, which is, what would the social distancing be in indigenous terms? Or as one of the issues that are subjacent to all of the work carried out with collectively with indigenous groups. What is this social adjective for distancing? So there's a theoretical discussion about good distancing, and we followed that track. And on that track, to develop the case study, we worked with all of those technologies and care that were handled by the indigenous peoples during COVID-19. So the idea that a distance should be made, the use of masks, one of the things that first came up above the Guaranis especially was, well, this being too close of kissing and sitting and hugging is not something we do. That's a white person's thing. And based on that, we talked a lot about what those distances would be. So we could think that, hearing and listening to the collectives, that an investment was made in terms of distancing from the whites or from those outside the indigenous communities. We have some communities that closed up their groups. You had to have an authorization to go in and to leave. One of our researchers, Elielson, commented that when they began to hear of the virus of COVID-19, and they went to São Miguel, they said that every time they needed to go to the cities, they used masks, and people looked at them very strangely. So he told us that since the very beginning, they had this, these measures were put into practice. These social distancing measures were taken into practice, but at the same time, in these distancings, we have some approximations as well with the deities, with all of these invisible beings, these invisible beings that were put into action for them to maintain healthy. So we had a play on distancing from others and approximation to others, like the deities, an exaggerated approximation. Not that it didn't exist before, but the prayers, the chants, the use of forest remedies, they were strengthened. They were strengthened in a way that was more latent. And the distancing from the whites, which was somehow something that happened beforehand, was further considered as a precaution and as a proof of what they already knew. Everything that comes from the white, everything that is caused by the white, we need to protect ourselves from. So the protective measures became more evident. I think from the case study of social distancing, that was what I wanted to mention. And one other point that seems to be very important to me is the relationship between the wind, pollution, the forests, and that take us to think about climate change, anthropocentric measures. Many of our interlocutors showed that the trees, the forests protect the people from the diseases. And they protect them in communion with that which the earth filters. Everything that is heavy and hot is filtered by the earth, it is absorbed by the earth. In this forest and land pair, what happens when these indigenous territories, well, not only indigenous territories, but forests in general, when they do not exist or when they're perishing, and the cement is taking over the land, disease happens, become more acute, because it is not possible for there to exist this flow between that which the wind brings, the forest protect, the land absorbs, and with the city, the cement, the pavement, well, the land is not able to cool this down. It is always hot, and that makes it so that the disease circulate more broadly. We have case studies as well of several speculations about the causes of COVID. Some of them are showing us that this comes as proof, all of them to some extent, and we can always guide our thoughts that this pertains to a lack of balance between the human relations. So a breach of the restrictions makes it so there is increased number of more powerful and deadly diseases, and this is also encompassed by this relation that I mentioned initially between the forest, the land, and this circle of the diseases, but some sort of buffering of what we would call nature that has been deteriorated in the past centuries. So this case study too, the case study on vaccination, which is what I said initially, was one that was elaborated in the scope of it was not elaborated in the meridional team, but one I was involved with is a transversal studies that brings data of all of the Brazilian regions, but based on the researchers that made this pair between the interlocution and being interlocutors and also researchers. Well, this case study about vaccination becomes very evident with what that I mentioned about childbirth in terms of care and trust. So we have an adhesion to the vaccine when those that are vaccinating or sharing information on the vaccines are people that I trust, for example, indigenous healthcare agents or in healthcare professionals with whom they've had a long dating relationship. When this vaccination comes from people that are not seen constantly or people over which we have doubts about in terms of their real intention, that adhesion to the vaccination program was much weaker. So that is one of the topics pertaining to the adhesion and lack thereof of vaccination. In many states, we have information on, whether on one hand we have an omission of data regarding the death by COVID by the Brazilian government. There's huge discussion about this. PB actually launched its own data on or counting, which is more loyal to the death resulting from COVID. In terms of vaccination, we have, this super publicity or excessive information about vaccination in the indigenous community. But at the same time, we don't know where this vaccination is taking place because this is general data, and we know that there's a lack of, there's discrepancy with what is being considered indigenous or not. If we think in terms of territorial means, only those indigenous peoples that lived on official indigenous lands or officially recognized territories were vaccinated. After, this decision was questioned or made public, we don't really have transparency of this data to know where this vaccination is taking place and what's happening with those indigenous peoples who are not in officially acknowledged territories, which are actually most.
Bem, esse era um ponto importante. Outro ponto sobre as noções de corpo e pessoa relacionada à vacinação, a vacinação como muitas vezes sendo vista como algo que,
imagine
que
that's
se coloca
something
no
you
corpo,
put
né?
on your
Então,
body, so
se agente externo que se coloca no corpo pode
it can
esfriar o
cool off
sangue,
the
que
body,
justamente é
and
o sangue é o que
the
vai
blood, I'm
o
sorry, and
sangue
the
fervendo
boiling
é
body
justamente
will
o que vai
actually
impedir que
impede
a
the disease
doença
from moving
avance.
forward.
A
We
gente
have
tem questões xamânicas,
some
por exemplo,
shaman
de
issues
julgar,
regarding to
de
not
não
being
ser
the
a
right
hora
time for
certa, né?
vaccination,
Então, não é ser
and
contrário à
not
vacinação,
being
mas saber
contrary
a
to
hora
vaccination, but
certa de
knowing
tomar
the right time to
a
be
vacina, que
vaccinated,
tem
which
a
also
ver
is
também
related
com
to
condições de
notions
noção
that
de corpo e
refer to
pessoa
the people
relacionadas
and
às
body
práticas
and shaman practices.
xamânicas.
So
Então, a gente
we
tem
have
interlocutores
interlocutors
interlocutoras
are
xamãs que dizem
who
que
said
demoraram para tomar a
they
vacina,
took
porque
long to
seus
take the
corpos não
vaccine because their
estavam
bodies were
fortes o
not
suficiente
strong
para
enough
tomar
for
a
the
vacina, porque a
vaccines,
vacina ela é pensada para
because
os
the
corpos de
vaccines are
brancos
thought
e não
of
para
for
os
the
corpos
bodies of whites and not for the
indígenas,
bodies of
então isso
indigenous
poderia
peoples. So
causar
that
algum
could
tipo de
cause
problema,
some
ou
sort
seja,
of problem.
não é
So
uma recusa
they're
da
not
vacina, mas é
they're not
escolher qual o
refusing
melhor
to take the
momento de
vaccine, but
tomar a
choosing the
vacina, que
best
tem a
moment
ver
for
com essa
that, which
preparar
has
o
to do
corpo
with
para tomar
preparing
a
the body
vacina,
for that.
né?
Above
Sobre essas
these
relações entre confiar e
relationships between
desconfiar
trusting or
daquilo
not
que vem
trusting
junto
that
com a
which
vacina,
comes with the
a gente tem
vaccine,
uma
we have a
relação
very
muito
close
estreita
tie
entre
between
o
what
que a
we
gente
generally
geralmente
divide
divide, né,
between
entre os
white
brancos,
as
entre
health
saúde
and
e
territory.
território, né? Bem,
Well, one of the
uma das
questions, the
perguntas
main questions
principais feitas era por que a gente tem
that
direito à
was made was
prioridade da
why
vacinação e a gente não tem os nossos territórios
do we have the
demarcados,
right to
né? Ou
priority
seja,
vaccine
são
but
duas
don't have
ações que vêm
demarked
do mesmo
territories? So
lugar,
these
a
are
gente pode
two
pensar
actions that
o
come from the
Estado, o
same
governo
place.
brasileiro,
We can think of
mas
the
a gente está
state or the
tendo
Brazilian
prioridade para tomar uma
government,
vacina que nos
but we're
injeta
having a
algo no
priority
corpo,
to
que
take a
nos altera
vaccine
o
that
nosso corpo,
injects something
mas a
into our
gente não
body
tem
that
direito
changes
ao
our
nosso
body,
território, nos é
but we
negado o nosso
don't have the
território, que é de
right
onde
to
vem a
our
nossa saúde.
territory,
Então,
which
essa
is
separação
denied,
entre
and that is where
saúde
our
e
health comes
território,
from.
ela esteve
So
muito
this
presente
separation
também
between health and territory were also
nessas
very
falas,
evident and
sobretudo do
present
Guarani, né?
in their words, above all
Então,
of
eu
the
acho que
Guarani
esses
people.
eram o que eu tinha para
So I
compartilhar
think
com vocês, dos
this is what I
principais
had to share
pontos
with you,
dos três
the
estudos de
main
caso. Falei pouco
topics of
rápido,
the 3 case studies.
mas os
I
estudos
spoke a
de
bit too
caso, eles
fast,
são
but the case
substanciosos
studies
também,
are
repetindo a palavra.
substantial.
Esses três estudos de caso,
These 3 case studies have
eles têm um corpo, digamos assim, e eu acredito que quem estiver interessado
a
em saber um pouco
body,
mais sobre isso
and I
vai
think that
poder
those who are
ler os
interested in learning a bit
estudos,
more
e eu
about them
espero
will
que
be able
todos
to
os
read
dados
these
que nós
cases, and I hope that all of the data
trouxemos ou estamos a trazer possam
that
ser
we have
úteis, né,
mentioned and that we are mentioning can be
próximas
useful
futuras pesquisas
for
e
future
também para que
research,
os nossos
as
próprios
well as
pesquisadores indígenas,
for
companheiros,
our
amigos indígenas
researchers
possam se valer desses dados
and
também
indigenous
para
friends can
tentar
make use of this data to
pleitear
try
melhorias
to
no atendimento de saúde
obtain
seus
better
coletivos.
health care and
Eu
collective
devo ter esquecido
and
monte
attention
de
to their
coisa, mas
collective
isso faz
actions.
parte de
I'm sure I
toda
have forgotten a lot of things,
fala,
but this
né?
is
Então, muito obrigada.
true for every talk.
Maria, muito
So thank you.
obrigado. Fecharam
Thank
da
you, Maria.
região sul do Brasil Meridional?
Did you close the
Sim,
southern
nós
region?
fechamos. Eu centralizei
Yes,
dessa
I've
vez. A gente
closed.
tem uma
I
equipe
think I centralized it all.
grande, mas a gente centralizou para eu
We have a
pontuar
large
só
team,
realmente os
but we
resultados,
centralized
as
it so that I
considerações
would
finais dos
mention
estudos
only
de
the
caso. A gente
results
já tinha
or the
feito
final
aqui uma coisa
remarks
que eu
of the
queria
case
já
studies. We
lhe
had
passar a
already,
palavra, dizer
well,
que
something
no
that I wanted to
fechamento da
mention.
nossa equipe do trabalho da equipe Brasil
When we
Meridional,
were
nós tivemos
closing our
último
work for
exercício,
this Meridional Brazil
que
team,
foi
we had a last
pedir a
exercise that we
todos os
carried out,
pesquisadores e
which was to
pesquisadoras
ask
que
all of the
fizessem
researchers
uma
involved
carta,
for them
escrito, ou
to
vídeo, ou áudio
write
sobre a
a
experiência da
letter or
PARI-c.
make a video
Então,
or
nós temos
audio
material
about
muito
their own
bonito de
experience.
retorno
So we have
desses
very
pesquisadores e
beautiful
pesquisadoras,
material
indígenas e não
of
indígenas,
feedback from these
conosco, e
researchers
que a gente espera
who are
dia
indigenous and
compartilhar, ou colocar no
non-indigenous as
site, ou
well.
escrever
And
alguma
we
coisa.
hope
Mas
to
foi
be able
muito
to share
importante para
this
nós
with you
esse
one day, to
fechamento.
write
Foi
something
fechamento
about
que
it or
nós
share it on
fizemos
the
de
site.
equipe.
But
E
this
nesse
closure was very
fechamento
important
surgiram
for us, which was one we carried out as a
vários
team.
depoimentos, vários
And during this
desafios,
closure,
e a
we have
gente,
several statements,
digamos que a
several
gente fez uma
challenges
coisa
that were
mais
mentioned.
reclusa
And let's
desse nosso
say we did
fechamento de
something that was
experiência da
more
PARI-c, e aqui nós
of ours. And we decided to share with you the final remarks about the case studies. Thank you so much, Maria. This is wonderful. This matter about the episiotomy is the treasure that you mentioned. You know, we have political information, actually, of women's movements, of both indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples. So, well, we don't have, we haven't had many questions on YouTube. I am not sure if anybody else who's with us wants to speak a bit longer, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, about something they have forgotten or something they would like to register at this time. Before we go back to Maria and to Christine for the closing. On my part, I just wanted to thank you again, thank the entire team again, and thank Maria and Chris and our colleagues, coordinators, people from the North, which were incredible, and to thank Kaori, Julia Kaori, who's a student, who helped us a great deal in raising information. And so I'm not sure if Amanda, Chris, Spency, or Valeria, if any of you, any of us who are here, would like to mention anything final. Go ahead. I had raised my hand, but I put it down soon afterwards. I wanted to comment something that I forgot regarding one of the main things that happened during the pandemic, which is the abandonment of C-sections and the basic care that took place during these years. And so we saw this abandonment of C-sections. The main people who provide this main care in terms of guidance. And there were not many psychological impacts that affected the ancients, the elderly, and the kids. And I wanted to mention this. I had forgotten to mention this in my presentation. That these agencies which work with indigenous health, with the project, we have had meetings within the Indian groups and talked about this lack of care, the lack of medication, the lack of fuel, a series of denouncements that were made. In 2021, we had, with this research, we heard of, from our ancients, heard of this demand, of what was lacking, what was missing. And so they reported that nowadays, in 2022, when they look for medication, they don't have any support for healthcare. If they need a medical consultation, they don't have it. So I wanted to add that. Thank you. Wonderful, Sheila. Thank you. I hope that we can also meet personally one day. We hope this happens. Adolfo's putting up a mosaic for the YouTube. So if you want to turn on your cameras, would anyone else like to speak? Okay, so I'm just going to make a small comment. I think Maria was totally able to represent us and to raise all of the topics. It was wonderful listening to her and hearing all of you as well. It was super positive. I just wanted to make a small comment of something that I was thinking about in terms of the methodology, which is the digital technology and our participation by means of these devices. And this was certainly a limiting factor with which we had to deal with. On the other hand, I think that regarding our communication in the Meridional Brazil group, and I'm not sure you agree with me, first we had less of this problem of the internet,
incisivos, né?
You know, we did
E
have
uma
this
coisa assim,
problem.
se por um lado a gente perdeu a oportunidade, né,
And something
de
that if
parte
we
dos
missed an
pesquisadores não
opportunity on
indígenas de
one
estar
side,
nas
in terms
aldeias
of parts of the
e
non-indigenous
viver essa
researchers
situação
being
juntos e compartilhando
in
as
the indian
práticas
communities
né,
and
e
living this
acompanhando
community
as
and
práticas,
practices and
né, e as
monitoring the
lutas ali
practices.
de combate e de,
And
né,
also the
enfim, de
struggles
dar conta né, da
in some
pandemia e
of
tudo
being
mais.
able
Eu acho que, por
to
outro
handle the
lado,
pandemic.
o fato dessas nossas
On the other
interlocuções,
hand,
tanto com os
the
pesquisadores
fact that
indígenas
these
como com
connections
as
of ours, both with the
interlocutores nas
indigenous
aldeias
researchers
que a
as
gente
well as
fez por
the
meio né, do Google
communicators within the
Meet, do
Indian
WhatsApp,
groups that were
etc.,
carried out with Google
trouxe
Meet and
uma
WhatsApp and so
dimensão
forth, this brought
muito
to us
reflexiva por parte desses
a
interlocutores,
very
né? Assim,
reflexive
então não era só
dimension
descrever as práticas, mas
on these
era
interlocutors.
já elaborar
So
uma
it was not only
reflexão
describing the practices, but
sobre
instead
elas e sobre a
elaborating
vida e sobre né,
reflection on them,
enfim,
on life,
toda né, não só as dificuldades
in some,
sanitárias, mas políticas e
not only
ambientais que
the
a gente está
sanitary
vivendo
difficulties,
nesse
but also
momento e que
political and
convergiu
environmental
ali
difficulties
tudo,
that we're
né?
going
Então
through
isso
right
acho que foi
now.
muito rico. A gente ter
And so
né,
I think this was
esse
very,
momento
very
em que
rich in terms
eles
of
também
us
estavam
having
nos
a
reportando
moment
algo
during
que a
which
gente
they
não
were
estava
also
vivendo ali
reporting
na hora,
something
né?
to
Não era
us that we
síncrono,
weren't
já
living,
estavam
we weren't going
reportando algo
through.
que eles estavam
At that time,
já
they
tinha
were reporting
acontecido
about
nas
something that had
aldeias, né?
already
Nessas
happened
conversas, e isso trouxe uma dimensão
in
de
these
uma
conversations, and
reflexão e
this
de uma
brought to us
elaboração por
a
parte dos
new
indígenas que
dimension
foi
for
muito
reflection and
densa
for
e
elaboration
muito
by the
bonita,
indigenous
né?
peoples that was
Tanto
quite
que, né,
complete and
nos
beautiful.
de caso a gente tem
So
poucos
much
diálogos
so
teóricos com outros
that in the case
antropólogos, porque
studies we have
toda a
very
reflexão
few
foi feita pelos
theoretical dialogues
indígenas
with the
mesmo, né? E
anthropologists
acho que
because
isso
all of the
né,
reflections were
trouxe
made
assim
by
para a
the
gente
indigenous
muitos
peoples, and I
aprendizados
think
e muita
this
riqueza, assim. Então foi,
brought
eu acho
much,
que
much
fazer essa
learning and wealth
ponderação
to
também
us.
é importante, né? Das
So to ponder
limitações,
this
mas
is
também
also
dessa
very
riqueza
important, you know,
de
the
de
limitations,
ter
but also
feito né,
this
esse trabalho em
richness
rede
of having done
nessas
this work in a
condições. Acho que essa
network
reflexão sobre as tecnologias
under these
digitais, ela
conditions. So there's
ainda tem
reflection
né,
about the
muito que a
digital
gente
technologies
refletir sobre, assim. Então
still
foi muito legal nesse sentido.
cause us to
Mas é
think
isso,
about
muito
a
obrigada.
lot.
Novamente
But
adorei
that's
ouvir
it. Thank you
todos
again.
vocês
I
e
loved
muito
listening to all
joia
of
estar aqui.
you, and it was
Obrigado,
great.
Valeria.
Thank
Muito
you.
obrigado. Bom te ouvir também.
Thank you,
Que bom que você se
Valeria.
animou a falar.
It was
Que bom.
really great. Great
Alguém
listening to
mais,
you.
gente?
Eu
Enfim.
queria agradecer.
Would anybody else like to say something?
É o nosso último evento, né?
Okay, go ahead.
Então, queria agradecer
Well,
finalmente a todos,
this is our
e aproveitar a
last
presença da
event,
professora Cristina
so I want to
aqui
thank
no nosso
everybody
evento, né, para me dirigir
and also
diretamente a
take the
ela,
opportunity
né, em
that
especial, aí,
Professor
lembrando que
Christine is with
nós
us,
estamos passando no
and I
Brasil
want to
por
make special reference to
período
her,
extremamente
and well,
delicado, perigoso,
specifically
de
say
muita
that in
fragilidade,
Brazil
né?
we're
Tanto
experiencing
para
a
os povos
very
indígenas como
delicate,
também para as
if not
universidades, né?
dangerous
E nesse
period,
sentido, né, nós
fraught with
agradecemos
frailty not only
imensamente, né,
for
por essa
indigenous peoples
oportunidade
but
de
also
colaboração,
for
de
universities.
de
So we really want
parceria,
to
né,
thank you for
porque
the opportunity
os
to
recursos para
collaborate
pesquisa no Brasil nesse
and
momento
have this partnership,
estão
because
sofrendo uma absoluta
resources
limitação.
allocated to
As
research
universidades
in
estão sendo
Brazil are
asfixiadas, né?
extremely limited right now.
Nesse
The
sentido,
universities are
essa
being
pesquisa literalmente ela
choked,
nos deu
that's the
fôlego,
word,
né? Ela nos
and
deu,
in that regard,
apresentou para nós
this
alento, né? Uma
research
oportunidade de realmente
gave us a new
alimentar essa rede
breath of
incrível, né, que vocês
life
estão tendo a
and an
oportunidade
opportunity
de ver, né,
to
num evento como
feed
esse, né, que nós
this
pudemos também
amazing
ver em
network
outros eventos
that
internos que
you
organizamos
have
ao
the
longo do
opportunity
nosso
to
percurso, né?
see.
Então é importante a gente exaltar, né,
So it's
essa
important
cooperação
to
internacional,
highlight
né, no que ela tem de mais
that this
importante,
international
né,
cooperation
realmente ajudando
is truly
a fomentar,
important
né,
in helping
as
us
carreiras, inclusive aí, né, das várias
foster
pesquisadores indígenas, né, nós
the
como professores
careers of
pudemos
several
apoiar nesse
researchers,
momento, né,
indigenous
atuamos como
researchers,
orientadores, né, nesse
and we as
processo, né?
professors,
Então
we worked as
isso, acho que é
monitors in
importante a
this
gente nesse momento
process.
final
So that's what I
sublinhar
wanted
isso,
to say.
exaltar e agradecer, né, por essa cooperação e por tudo aí que ela nos
So
proporcionou.
thank you for the cooperation.
Incrível, né? De
It was
pesquisa
truly an
num
amazing
momento,
year.
de como outros pesquisadores aí ao
So
longo
during the
dessas
last
2 horas e meia, 3 horas aí,
3 hours, many
lembraram, né,
researchers
de muita
mentioned
fragilidade psicológica,
and
né, e de muitas perdas, né,
mentioned
também,
that it was a period of a lot
de
of
gente querida, né, em tantas
uncertainty
comunidades, né.
and psychological
Obrigado, Spence. A
fragility.
gente tem uma pergunta do público
Thank you.
e tem
Thank you,
dos
Spencer. We
pesquisadores
have
pediu a palavra, mas a gente
a question
precisa,
from
por
the
razões
audience.
do timing da tradução, passar a palavra para
But first, we
Maria e
have to
para
give the floor to
Christine
Maria and
antes
to Christine
de outras
before
intervenções.
we have other comments. So,
Obrigada,
Maria.
Zé. Bem, a gente está
Thank you.
terminando, né? Eu acho muito bom que as pessoas façam
We're
perguntas.
almost
Eu acho que a gente pode
wrapping up.
continuar aqui depois, mas eu acho que é bom a gente, pelo menos no
But
prazo, né, apresentar
before
as principais questões.
we finish,
A minha fala
I'd like to say
de
something.
encerramento, assim, eu gostaria de dizer
I want to say that
lembrar que são 9 estudos de casos, 9
new
estudos de
case
casos
studies
estarão
will
na
be
plataforma.
available on the
A plataforma
platform, and the
ficará
platform will be
disponível
available
nos
for the
próximos
next
4
4
anos.
years.
Depois disso a gente vê se a gente vai, como que a gente vai fazer para manter, porque existe um custo. A gente talvez continue ou não com esse
We
projeto,
might
ou seja,
go
buscaremos
on with
outros
the project
financiamentos, mas
or
por
not,
enquanto a gente está
looking
focando
for
em fazer esse
other
término,
forms of funding and
absorver o que a
whatnot.
gente
But right
conseguiu
now,
levantar,
we want to
aprender,
really
mas a gente sabe,
complete
que
this
é
stage
uma expectativa dos
and
nossos parceiros,
compile
pesquisadores
our
indígenas, que
findings.
exista
And we
uma
also know
continuidade,
that
né?
the
Então, o que
indigenous
eu tenho a
researchers,
dizer
our
também para
partners,
vocês é que,
want
independente
this
de
project to
nós
continue. So what I can tell you is
estamos
that
coordenando esse
irrespective
projeto, que
of
todos os
us
nossos
who are
colegas,
coordinating
né,
this
indígenas
project,
e não indígenas,
all
que
of our
se interessem
colleagues,
em ter uma continuidade
indigenous
desse
or
tipo
not,
de projeto,
that are
vão
interested
adiante.
in moving
Porque eu
forward
acho que
with
esse
the
modelo de
project, that they
colaboração,
should
a forma como a
go
gente vem
ahead,
desenhando
because
esse
this
projeto, ele é rico
form
e
of
eu acredito que
collaboration
ele é
is
caminho
really,
para a gente
I
fazer uma
believe,
antropologia cada
the
vez
way
mais
forward
crítica,
if
né,
we
cada
want to
vez
build
mais
an
revendo
increasingly critic
os seus objetos, as suas
anthropology,
interlocuções, os seus métodos.
reviewing
E eu passo a palavra para
our
a Cris
methods
para falar
and
pouquinho também.
purposes.
E qualquer coisa eu
And
estou por
well,
aqui, eu vou continuar
with
por
that,
aqui
I
nas
want to give the
perguntas.
floor
Eu
to
só
Chris,
gostaria de
and
fazer
I'll be
esses
here
comentários, assim, que
for
são
the
mais
Q&A.
comentários de talvez abrindo
Those were my
portas
comments,
para um futuro,
and
né?
maybe to leave the doors open for
De novas parcerias ou
a future with new partnerships
feitas em novos
or new
formatos.
forms of
Obrigada.
partnership.
I
Thank
want
you.
to be very brief, I think. I'd rather hear people's questions and discussion, but just to say that we want to, yes, as Maria Paula said, we want to focus on the consolidation and the writing and the publications, but the Medical Research Council is certainly encouraging us to look at further applications, which is great. Unfortunately, the UK government cut its contribution to overseas funding. I think it's very short-sighted, and this project illustrates how short-sighted it was. The MRC did very well to protect our funding in a difficult situation. We also have some plans to do more dissemination work in terms of an exhibition, and we can talk more about that soon, I hope.
Muito obrigado, Christine e Maria.
Thank you,
Bom,
Christine
eu
and
sugiro,
Maria.
então, a gente tem uma pergunta
We have a question
Márcia Nóbrega,
from
que eu
Marcia,
vou passar, então vou ler
and
aqui, passar
I'll
e
read
dirigir
it.
às pesquisadoras indígenas,
And
especialmente. Ela disse assim,
she
gostaria de perguntar às
says, I'd like
pesquisadoras
to ask
indígenas
the indigenous
como elas avaliam e
researchers how they
consideram os impactos
see
da entrada da
the
internet,
impacts of
tendo em
the
vista essa ética
use
dos
of
cuidados dos territórios
internet
a partir do marco
initiating
da
with the
pandemia.
pandemic.
E aí
And
o Júlio
Julio
tinha pedido
also
também a palavra,
had,
então,
when it had raised his
Fran,
hand. So
Sheila,
Fran,
Júlio.
Sheila, and Julio, you have the
Bom,
floor.
deixa eu agradecer a minha
Well,
participação
first I
nessa
want to
pesquisa, né, assim como
thank
da
you
Maria
for
também. É
letting me participate
excelente
in this
canal que a
research
gente
on
vem
behalf of the
realizando, né,
Pinagé
virtualmente nessa pesquisa,
population.
que
It's a
é
very important
considerada como
work
internacional.
that's being done.
E é muito importante
And very
agradecer
importantly,
a Maria,
also want to thank
Cristina
Christine
e Maria
and Maria
Prats, esqueci o nome. Isso é muito importante. Com relação, eu não sei se eu
And
entendi bem a pergunta
I don't know if I
com
understood your
relação às
question
informações,
concerning, is it concerning
pandemia
the pandemic or
o
access to
acesso a
virtual
conhecimentos
knowledge? Is that what you
virtuais? Eu não sei se
asked
foi
or the
bem essa
audience asked?
pergunta,
But anyway,
mas assim, com
concerning
relação a essa
this
situação que
situation
nós
that we're now
estamos
facing,
enfrentando, é
that's
muito delicada, porque às vezes a gente
quite
se encontra numa
touchy
situação
because we may
confortável,
be in a
mas
comfortable
outras
situation, but other
regiões do
regions
Brasil,
of Brazil
às vezes não se
might
encontra
not
em uma
be
situação
facing the
confortável.
same type of
Mas mesmo assim a
comfortable
gente está
situation,
enfrentando nessa
but
dificuldade de pandemia
still
e a nossa
our
luta continua.
struggle continues.
Bem,
I
não sei
don't
se eu
know if I
entendi bem a
answered the
pergunta.
question, but thank you.
E obrigado.
Obrigado, Júlio. Não sei, Sheila,
Thanks, Julio.
Ruchan, Fran, se querem
Sheila,
né? Eu acho que uma
Ruchan,
pergunta que diz também
or
a respeito dessa
France,
coisa da entrada
if
maior
you
da
want to say something.
internet em algumas comunidades, em alguns
I
territórios.
think the question's more related to
Fran, você
the
quer responder a sua
use
comadre?
of internet by some communities and territories. Fran, would you like to answer the question?
É uma pergunta muito interessante, né? Porque assim,
Well, that's a
acho
very
que
interesting
tem
question.
dois pontos, né? O primeiro, que facilita a comunicação
And I
de
think it's
comunidades que estão
two-sided.
muito
For
distantes,
one, it
facilita a
enables the
comunicação
communication
para
of
fazer o
faraway
pedido de
communities.
resgate, caso
It makes it
haja um paciente no
possible
estado
for
grave,
communities
não
to
só questão
ask
de
for
Covid, mas
help
outros tipos
or
de doença.
rescue if there's
Mas ao
any
mesmo as comunidades,
patient with a severe disease, not only COVID, but also other diseases. And I'm talking specifically about my community. We have one point of access to the internet, but we only use that to communicate with people, like for uni, or to enable communication between parents and the kids at school or college, because the connection's really poor, really poor, to the point that sometimes you're not able to download an audio file or a document. But I think that during the pandemic, it was a facilitator, because at least we are able to get information about the arrival of healthcare teams, and we can relay that information through our radio services. So in the case of our community, these points of access are fundamentally placed in a strategic location, and it's really important that we have more points of access to the internet for the entire community, because it's truly an asset. But not everybody uses the internet, though. My father, for instance, he can't even use a smartphone. So often that's just used by professors and leaders, and they are usually in charge of establishing communication with other people outside of the community. So we use that tool on our behalf, on behalf of health and education and other aspects. So I would say it is positive for us, at least, who live in the middle of the forest with no access to hospitals or doctors or clinics. So it is a fundamental tool for us. So I would say it.
Obrigada, Zé.
I would say I see it as
eu
a
acho que
positive tool.
o que eu queria falar, eu já tinha falado, e a Cris também. Então, obrigada também por todo o teu empenho em sediar o evento, em organizar esse nosso encontro. A gente tem esse encontro final, né? Mas nós já tínhamos tido também o nosso encontro final interno, para quem não sabe, foi em 30 de novembro. E eu acho que é um começo de alguma outra coisa, a gente ainda não sabe muito bem o que vai vir, mas eu realmente, como eu disse antes, eu encorajo pesquisadores e pesquisadoras indígenas, nossos colegas, os co-investigators, a abrir novas frentes decorrentes da PARI-c, porque é um projeto grande, enorme, robusto em termos de abrangência, em termos de recursos, mas ele é como um meteoro. E eu acho que ele deixa várias coisas a serem feitas com uma maior profundidade, mas os laços que nós criamos, as relações o projeto todo foi montado em cima de relações pré-existentes, mas ao mesmo tempo criou novas relações, né? Então, eu espero que isso reverbere em novos trabalhos, novas parcerias, novos afetos, que eu acho que isso também faz parte, né? Eu terminei trabalhando com netos e filhos das minhas amigas Guarani, ou seja, novas fases, novas formas de se dar continuidade, né? A fazer pesquisa. Eu acho que é isso. Não ia falar muito, mas já falei muito. Muito obrigada.
É isso, Maria. Encerramos aqui, então. Muito obrigado a todo mundo e, bom, até a próxima, né? Tchau.